Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the water holds its breath and the world keeps its oldest stories pressed close to the bottom, safe from sunlight, safe from time, safe from everything except the slow, patient pressure of depth. Tonight, we're not going to the ocean, though we might as well be. We're going to a lake, a still, clear mountain lake in the southwest of China, ringed by forest and wrapped in a quiet so complete that fishermen say you can hear the silence itself if you sit long enough on the shore. And beneath that silence, beneath all that extraordinary blue water, something waits, something that may have once been a city. Fuxian Lake sits in Yunnan province, in the southwestern corner of China, a region of high plateaus, volcanic terrain, and a landscape that feels old in a way that is difficult to explain and easy to feel. The lake itself covers approximately 155 square kilometres of surface area, which sounds large, but it is the depth that truly defines it. The average depth is around 87 metres. The deepest point drops to approximately 155 metres, making Fuxian the third deepest lake in all of China and one of the deepest freshwater lakes in Asia. To put that in terms your body can understand, the deepest point of this lake is taller than a 40-storey building, and the water above it presses down with a weight that would crush most things we consider sturdy. You do not simply swim to the bottom of Fuxian Lake. You do not simply look down and see what is there. And yet, what makes this lake remarkable is not just its depth. It is what the water reveals before the depth takes over. Fuxian Lake is fed largely by underground springs rather than rivers, which means the water that fills it has been filtered through rock and earth before it ever reaches the surface. The result is a clarity that feels almost unnatural. Visibility in the upper layers can reach as far as 12 metres, which for a lake of this size is extraordinary. The water has a quality that photographers and tourists describe as crystalline, almost luminous. A pale, greenish blue that shifts depending on the light and the season. On calm mornings, the surface reflects the surrounding mountains so perfectly that the boundary between lake and sky becomes genuinely difficult to find. It is the kind of place that makes you feel slightly outside of ordinary time. The mountains that surround Fuxian Lake are covered in subtropical forest, layered and dense, dropping steeply toward the shoreline in places and flattening into cultivated terraces and small villages in others. The air at this altitude, roughly 500 to 600 metres above sea level, carries a particular quality that travellers notice immediately. It is cooler than you expect for a subtropical region, softer somehow, with the smell of pine and damp earth, mixing with whatever the lake exhales in the early hours. This is not a harsh or dramatic landscape. It is the kind of landscape that invites you to stay longer than you planned. People have been staying longer than planned here for a very long time. The Yi people, one of the largest ethnic minority groups in Yunnan province, have lived around Fuxian Lake for centuries. They are not newcomers to this shoreline. Their culture, their architecture, their agricultural patterns, their festivals, and their language are all woven into this specific geography in ways that take generations to build. The Pu people, an older ethnic group whose history in the region predates many of the more widely documented civilizations, also carry connections to this lake that reach back further than written records in the area can confirm. These communities did not simply settle near the water because it was convenient. They settled here because the lake is alive in their cultural imagination in a way that goes beyond resource or geography. And one of the most persistent things they carry in that imagination is a story about what the lake hides. The oral traditions of the Yi and Pu people around Fuxian Lake include accounts of a city that once stood where the water now sits. Not a village, not a small settlement. A city with roads and markets and buildings, a place of some importance and prosperity, before something happened and it was swallowed. The details of what happened vary depending on who is telling the story and which generation is passing it along. Some versions describe a flood, sudden and catastrophic. Some describe the earth moving, the ground itself shifting and dropping. Some versions are more metaphorical, speaking of a city that sinned or was careless, or was simply unlucky in the way that places sometimes are. But across all of these versions, the lake is not just a lake. It is a place where something used to be. And that idea has been carried carefully from grandparent to grandchild for longer than anyone can precisely measure. For most of the outside world, these were stories. The kind of stories that get filed under local legend, appreciated for their cultural texture, acknowledged politely, and then set aside in favour of more documented history. That is not unusual. Oral traditions from indigenous and minority communities have a long history of being underestimated by outside observers, which is worth noting now because, as we'll see, this particular story turned out to be pointing at something real enough to be filmed. Before we go any further into the water, I want to ask you something gentle. Where are you listening from tonight? Is there water nearby, a river, a lake, a harbour, even rain against a window? And what time is it where you are? Because there is something about the particular hour when the world gets quiet that makes a story like this one feel closer. When the noise of the day is settled and you have a little room to imagine what might be sitting, undisturbed at the bottom of a very deep, very clear lake on the other side of the world. Whatever your answer is, I'm glad you're here. And if this is the kind of quiet, curious storytelling that you find yourself returning to, it would mean a great deal if you like this video or subscribe to Life Beyond Seen. It is a small thing that genuinely helps this channel reach more people who might need exactly this kind of company in a quiet hour. Now, let us go a little deeper. Fuxian Lake has been known to the outside scientific and geographic community for a long time, of course. It appears in provincial records, in natural history surveys, in the notes of botanists and geographers who passed through Yunnan during the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was admired for its clarity and its depth, studied for its ecology, and appreciated as one of the more visually striking lakes in a province that is not short of visually striking lakes. But it was not considered mysterious in any particular way. It was a beautiful, deep, clean mountain lake. Full stop. That changed in 1992, though the change came slowly, the way most important changes do, not with an announcement or a press conference or a dramatic unveiling, but with one person going into the water and coming back up with a look on their face that was difficult to explain. A diver named Geng Wei made his first dive in Fuxian Lake that year. He was not a professional archaeologist. He was an enthusiast, someone drawn to the water for its own sake, someone who had been diving in various locations around Yunnan and was curious about what the famous clarity of Fuxian might reveal at depth. What he reportedly found was not a fish or a rock formation, or a particularly interesting piece of geology. What he reportedly found were walls, stone structures, what appeared to be paved surfaces and platforms, and the kind of regular, deliberate geometry that does not tend to occur naturally. He surfaced, and the story of Fuxian Lake was never quite the same again. Now it's important to hold that account carefully. Geng Wei was not a trained archaeologist. He had no instruments for measurement or dating. He had no institutional affiliation that would lend formal authority to his claims. He had his eyes, his experience as a diver, and a deep conviction that what he had seen was not natural. And in the years that followed, he returned. Again and again he went back into the lake, refining his understanding of what was down there, mapping it in his own rough way, trying to communicate to anyone who would listen that something significant lay beneath the surface of this extraordinarily clear, extraordinarily deep mountain lake in Yunnan province. The world, for the most part, was politely sceptical, but Geng Wei kept diving. What he was describing, and what would eventually be captured on video for the first time in 2001, when he led a larger, more organised dive team into the lake, were structures of a scale and regularity that were difficult to dismiss entirely. Stone blocks, what appeared to be a staircase, wide, flat paved surfaces spread across the lake bed, and the sheer extent of it, not a single anomalous rock, not one unusual formation, but something that seemed to spread across a significant area of the bottom. The footage from 2001 was rough, as underwater footage often is, blurred in places by particulate matter, shadowed in others by the depth and the cold, but it was enough to make people look twice. It was enough to make the question feel real. And the question, once it takes root, is not an easy one to set aside. Because if those structures are what they appear to be, if they are truly the remains of something built by human hands, then the questions that follow are enormous. Who built them? When did they build them? What kind of civilization would leave behind stone platforms and paved roads in a place that is now 30 to 40 metres underwater? How does a city end up at the bottom of a lake? And perhaps most quietly, most persistently, why has it taken this long for the world outside Yunnan to pay attention to what the Yi and Pu people have apparently known, in their own way, for generations? These are the questions that Fuxian Lake has been holding beneath its clear, cold, beautiful surface. And they are the questions we are going to spend tonight trying to understand. Not to resolve them entirely, because the honest answer is that they have not been resolved, not officially, not yet. But to trace the shape of what is known, what is suspected, what is geologically possible, and what remains genuinely, fascinatingly open. The lake sits there tonight as it always has, reflecting whatever skies above it, fed by its underground springs, resting in its mountain bowl with the patience of something that has been waiting a very long time. The local fishermen know its moods, the forest around it knows its seasons, and somewhere below the surface, in the cold and the dark and the silence of considerable depth, something sits that may or may not have once been walked on by human feet. In 1992, a diver named Geng Wei went into that water and came back with a story, and everything that followed from that moment is where we are going next. To understand what Geng Wei actually saw in those early dives, it helps to understand something about the lake itself at depth. Fuxian Lake is not simply deep in the way that a quarry or a reservoir is deep. It is deep in the way that certain places feel when you're inside them, as though the space itself has weight. At the surface, the water is famously clear, extraordinarily so by any standard, with visibility extending up to 12 metres on a calm day. Light filters down through it in long, clean columns. But as you descend, as the depth increases past 20 metres, past 30, the light begins to thin and change colour. The warm spectrum drops away first. Reds and oranges fade, then yellows. What remains is a cooler, dimmer blue, and below that, as you push toward the deeper sections of the lakebed, something closer to a quiet, pressured darkness. The water temperature drops steadily. The cold is not dramatic in the way that a plunge into winter air is dramatic. It is gradual, patient, the kind of cold that settles into your hands and your thinking before you fully register it. This is the environment in which Geng Wei was operating, with relatively modest equipment by modern standards, without the benefit of remotely operated cameras or sonar mapping, or any of the tools that a professional marine archaeological team would bring to a site. He was a diver with a passion for water and an eye for what did not belong, and what he described in the accounts he gave over the years following that first 1992 dive was not subtle. He was not talking about a single unusual rock or a suggestive shadow on the lakebed. He described large stone structures, platforms of considerable size, what appeared to be walls running in straight lines, and surfaces that had the quality of paved ground rather than natural sediment. He described the geometry of it, the regularity, the sense that the shapes he was moving through had been arranged rather than deposited. For a non-archaeologist, his descriptions were remarkably consistent across multiple accounts, and that consistency is part of what kept the story alive even when formal institutions showed little interest in pursuing it. Geng Wei returned to the lake repeatedly through the 1990s, sometimes alone, sometimes with small groups of fellow divers, refining his sense of the layout below. He was, in a way, doing what explorers have always done before the professionals arrive. He was mapping the territory in his own imperfect, committed, deeply personal way. He drew sketches, he made notes, He tried to communicate the scale of what he believed was down there. The structures he maintained were not confined to one small area. They spread across a significant portion of the lakebed, covering by his estimates a substantial expanse of ground. He was not describing a ruin in the sense of a single collapsed building. He was describing something that felt to him like the footprint of a settlement, a place where people had lived and moved and built things that were meant to last. The skepticism he encountered was understandable, and it is worth being fair about that. Amateur divers reporting underwater ruins is not, historically speaking, a rare occurrence. Lakes and reservoirs and coastal waters around the world have produced countless such claims, most of which turn out to be natural geological formations that, under the particular conditions of underwater visibility and the particular psychology of someone who is already half hoping to find something remarkable, can take on the appearance of human construction. The human eye is extraordinarily good at finding patterns. It is in fact so good at finding patterns that it frequently finds them where none exist. Archaeologists and geologists know this, which is why they insist on physical sampling, on measurement, on the kind of rigorous documentation that an amateur diver with a personal conviction cannot easily provide. So the skepticism was not dismissiveness for its own sake. It was the normal and necessary caution of disciplines that have been fooled before. But Geng Wei was not easily deterred, and his persistence eventually produced something more substantial than personal testimony. In 2001, he organised a more formal dive expedition, bringing together a larger team and, crucially, underwater video equipment capable of capturing footage that could be reviewed by people who had not been there. This was the moment when the story of Fuxian Lake moved from one man's account to something that a wider audience could at least partially evaluate for themselves. The footage that emerged from those 2001 dives was, by any fair description, genuinely interesting. It showed stone blocks of considerable size, fitted together in ways that at minimum demanded an explanation. It showed what appeared to be a staircase, a series of regular descending steps cut into stone, the kind of feature that is almost impossible to produce naturally. It showed wide, flat surfaces that had the character of paving rather than natural rock, and it showed all of this spread across an area of the lakebed that was too extensive to be easily dismissed as a localized geological quirk. The footage was rough. It was dark in places, blurred in others, interrupted by the particulate matter that swirls through water when divers move through it. Underwater videography in those conditions at that depth, with the equipment available in 2001, was not going to produce the kind of crisp, well-lit documentation that a television audience might hope for. But it was enough. It was enough to make the question serious, at least in the eyes of people who watched it without a predetermined conclusion. The public reaction in China when the footage began to circulate was a mixture of fascination and uncertainty that is probably the most honest response anyone could have to evidence of this kind. Not proof, not dismissal, but a genuine and somewhat uncomfortable middle ground where the question sits and refuses to resolve itself neatly. What made the 2001 footage particularly significant beyond its content was what it represented in terms of Geng Wei's own story. He had been making these claims for 9 years by that point. 9 years of returning to the lake, 9 years of trying to describe something that resisted easy description, 9 years of being taken seriously by some and politely ignored by others. The video was his attempt to move the conversation from testimony to evidence, and in that limited sense it succeeded. People could no longer simply say that one man had seen something unusual and drawn his own conclusions. There was now something to look at, something to argue about, something that required at least an attempt at explanation from those who doubted it. The broader dive expeditions that followed over the next few years, through 2001 and into the mid-2000s, added more detail to the picture. Multiple divers explored different sections of the lakebed and returned with consistent descriptions of what they found. The structures they reported appeared to cover an area of roughly 2.5 square kilometres, which is not a small footprint. They described platforms of stone that were in some cases more than 60 metres wide. They described what appeared to be roads or pathways connecting different areas of the site. They described walls. And they described at least one structure that had a quality unlike the others, something that some accounts compared to a stepped platform or pyramid, with what appeared to be a circular opening near its top, roughly 3 metres across. This particular feature became one of the more discussed elements of the site, partly because its shape was unusual enough to resist easy categorization, and partly because it suggested, if it was genuinely man-made, a level of architectural intention that went beyond a simple construction. The stones themselves, in all the accounts that described them closely, appeared to be cut rather than naturally fractured. Natural rock breaks along fault lines and planes of weakness in ways that produce irregular, angular shapes. Cut stone has a different quality: flatter faces, more consistent dimensions, edges that meet at angles that suggest deliberate shaping. Multiple divers noted this quality in the Fuxian Lake stones, and it is one of the details that makes the natural formation explanation difficult, though not impossible to sustain. Certain geological processes can produce surprisingly regular stone formations. Basalt columns, for instance, can form in near-perfect hexagonal arrays through the simple physics of cooling lava. Limestone karst can produce formations that, in the right light and at the right depth, resemble walls and platforms. Geology is, in its way, a remarkably creative process, but the specific combination of features reported at Fuxian Lake, the scale, the apparent variety of architectural forms, the distribution across a large area of the lakebed, pushes against the simplest geological explanations without quite overcoming them. There is also the matter of what was not found. No artifacts were officially recovered from the structures during any of these expeditions. No pottery fragments, no tools, no inscriptions, no organic material of any kind that could be subjected to dating analysis. This absence is significant, and it cuts in two directions simultaneously. On one hand, it means that the case for human construction cannot be made on the basis of associated material culture, which is normally how archaeologists establish that a site was inhabited. On the other hand, the absence of surface artifacts at a site that has been submerged for potentially hundreds or thousands of years is not particularly surprising. Organic materials decompose, lighter objects are moved by water currents, sediment covers and conceals. The lakebed is not a museum with everything left in place. It is an active underwater environment that has been rearranging itself, however slowly, for as long as the water has been there. The absence of recovered artifacts tells us something, but it does not tell us everything, and it would be too simple to treat it as a decisive argument against the structures being man-made. What the 2001 footage and the subsequent expeditions of the early 2000s ultimately produced was not a resolution but a sharpening of the question. Before Gangwei's video, the Fuxian Lake story was essentially a personal account, interesting but unverifiable. After it, the story became something that the broader archaeological and scientific community at least had to acknowledge existed, even if their acknowledgement mostly took the form of cautious, non-committal statements about the need for further investigation. That is not nothing. In the world of archaeological mysteries, getting the question taken seriously enough to warrant a cautious statement from a professional is often the first step towards something more. And in 2006, something more did arrive, though it came with its own complications and its own careful ambiguities. But before we get there, we need to understand something about the land itself, about the history of the Yunnan Plateau, and the people who lived on it long before any of this became a question for divers and archaeologists. Because the structures in the lake did not appear in a historical vacuum. If they are real, if they were built by human hands, then those hands belong to someone. And understanding who might have built something of this scale in this particular part of the world requires going back much further than 1992, back past the living memory of anyone now alive, back into a history that is only partially written and partially preserved, and that in some important ways has only recently begun to receive the attention it deserves. The Yunnan Plateau is one of those places that rewards patience. Not the patience of waiting for something to happen, but the deeper kind, the patience of sitting with the landscape long enough to begin to feel its age. It sits at an elevation of roughly 2,000 metres above sea level, a high tableland rimmed by mountain ranges, cut through by river valleys, and scattered with lakes that catch the light in the late afternoon, in a way that makes the whole region feel slightly out of time. It is subtropical, but cool. Lush, but not tropical in the way of lowland jungles. It has a quality that travellers have remarked on for centuries, something about the air, the clarity of the sky, the sense that the ordinary rules of geography have been quietly suspended. And it has been home to human beings for a very long time. Archaeological evidence from Yunnan province suggests continuous human habitation stretching back tens of thousands of years. Stone tools, burial sites, rock art, and early settlement traces have been found across the plateau in numbers that speak to a long and layered history of human presence. By the time we reach the period that concerns us most directly, the period that produced the kind of organised, architecturally ambitious civilization that could theoretically have built the structures now lying beneath Fuxian Lake, we are looking at a civilization that modern archaeology has only relatively recently begun to understand in its full complexity. That civilization is known as the Dian Kingdom, and it is one of the more fascinating and underappreciated cultures of ancient China. The Dian people flourished on the Yunnan Plateau from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, a span of several hundred years during which they developed a remarkably sophisticated culture that in many ways operated independently of the great Chinese dynasties to their north. They were not a marginal or peripheral people. They were, by the evidence, a prosperous, hierarchically organised society with skilled craftspeople, complex ritual practices, and a material culture of striking quality. What we know about them comes primarily from two sources: the records of the Han Dynasty, which eventually absorbed the Dian Kingdom into the Chinese imperial system, and the remarkable contents of a burial site that was excavated in the mid-20th century, and that changed the way historians thought about this entire region. That site is called Shizhaishan, and it sits near the shores of Fuxian Lake's neighbour, Dian Lake, not far from where the city of Kunming stands today. Excavations conducted between 1955 and 1960 uncovered a cemetery containing dozens of elite burials, and what emerged from those graves was extraordinary. More than 4,000 bronze objects were recovered, including weapons, tools, ornaments, and a category of object that has become the defining symbol of Dian culture, the bronze cowrie container. These are lidded bronze vessels, typically cylindrical, whose lids are decorated with three-dimensional sculptural scenes of astonishing detail. Agricultural rituals, battle scenes, human sacrifices, market gatherings, ceremonial processions, all rendered in miniature bronze with a level of craft that suggests a culture entirely at ease with complex artistic ambition. One of the most famous examples shows a ritual scene with dozens of individual figures, each distinct, each positioned in relation to the others with clear compositional intention. It is in effect a frozen moment of Dian life, preserved in metal for 2,000 years. The Shijiaishan bronzes also included large ceremonial drums, weapons inlaid with turquoise and other materials, and gold objects that spoke to significant wealth concentrated in the hands of an elite class. The Han Dynasty records, particularly the account found in the Shiji, the great historical text compiled by Sima Qian in the 1st century BCE, describe the Dian kingdom as a distinct polity with its own king, its own customs, and its own relationship to the surrounding world. The Han records note that the Dian king received a golden seal from the Han emperor, a sign of formal recognition that also served as a gentle assertion of Chinese imperial authority over a region that had previously operated on its own terms. The seal itself was actually recovered at Shijiaishan, a small golden object inscribed with the words Dian Wang Ji Yin, meaning seal of the king of Dian, which is the kind of discovery that makes archaeologists sit down very quietly for a moment. What the Shijiaishan excavations confirmed, beyond the sophistication of Dian material culture, was that this was a civilization capable of large-scale, organised effort. Building a cemetery of this kind, maintaining the ritual and social structures that the bronze scenes depict, sustaining the craft workshops that produced thousands of high-quality bronze objects over several centuries, all of this requires organisation, resources, and permanence. It requires, in short, the kind of civilization that builds cities, and yet the capital of the Dian kingdom has never been definitively identified. The Han records mention a Dian capital, but they do not give its precise location with enough specificity to allow modern archaeologists to point to a map and say, here. Various sites around the Yunnan lakes have been proposed over the years, and Fuxian Lake, sitting within the broader Dian heartland, has been mentioned more than once in this context. This is where the underwater structures and the historical record begin to speak to each other, not loudly, not conclusively, but in a way that is at least worth listening to. If the Dian kingdom maintained a capital or a major ceremonial centre somewhere in the Yunnan Lake district, and if that centre was subsequently submerged through geological processes that we know did occur in this tectonically active region, then the structures beneath Fuxian Lake could, in principle, represent precisely that lost capital. The geographical fit is plausible, the chronological fit is plausible, the cultural fit, given what the Shijiaishan bronzes tell us about Dian architectural and organisational capacity, is plausible. None of this constitutes proof. Plausibility is not the same as evidence, and a good mystery can be made to sound plausible in many directions simultaneously. But it does mean that the Dian Kingdom hypothesis is not a wild or fringe idea. It is in fact one of the more reasonable frameworks for thinking about what the structures might be. It is also worth noting that the Dian Kingdom was not the only civilization that occupied this region, before recorded history caught up with it. The Yunnan Plateau has a deep stratigraphy of human cultures, layer upon layer of peoples who arrived, adapted, built, declined, and were succeeded by others. Before the Dian, there were Bronze Age cultures whose traces are less well documented, but whose presence is confirmed by scattered archaeological finds across the plateau. Before them, Neolithic communities. Before them, the long Paleolithic record of human presence that stretches back through the deep past. Any of these layers could, in theory, have left structures on the landscape that were later submerged. The further back you go, the more speculative the claim becomes, but the principle holds. The Yunnan Plateau was not empty before the Dian, and the Dian were not the last word in the region's ancient history. The Yi people, who have lived around Fuxian Lake for generations, and who carry oral traditions about a sunken city, are themselves part of this long-layered history. The Yi are one of the largest ethnic minority groups in China, with a population today of several million people spread across Yunnan, Sichuan, and neighbouring provinces. Their history in the Yunnan region predates the Han Chinese presence by a considerable margin, and their oral traditions, while not archaeological evidence in the formal sense, carry the weight of long memory. When Yi elders speak of a city that sank beneath Fuxian Lake, they are not repeating a story they read somewhere. They are transmitting something that has been passed from person to person across more generations than anyone can count, and that kind of transmission, however imperfect and subject to embellishment over time, often preserves a kernel of geographic or historical truth. The Pu people, an older ethnic group whose descendants are sometimes identified with the earliest inhabitants of the Yunnan Lake district, also carry traditions connected to the lake and its depths. Their presence in the region likely predates even the Dan kingdom, and their oral memory, fragmentary as it is, adds another thread to the web of human connection to this particular body of water. It is perhaps not coincidental that a lake with this depth of human history surrounding it should also be the lake where, when someone finally looked beneath the surface, they found something that demanded explanation. There is a broader pattern worth recognising here, one that the history of archaeology has demonstrated repeatedly across different continents and cultures. Oral traditions, for a long time dismissed by academic historians as unreliable folklore, have, in case after case, turned out to preserve genuine historical information. The most famous example is probably Troy. For centuries, educated Europeans treated Homer's account of the Trojan War as pure legend, a beautiful story with no more factual basis than a fairy tale. Then Heinrich Schliemann, working in the 1870s at a site in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, found not one Troy but 9 successive cities built on top of each other, each one representing a different era of occupation, and one of them showing evidence of violent destruction at roughly the right period. The legend had been pointing at a real place all along. More recently, the submerged landscape of Doggerland, the land bridge that once connected Britain to continental Europe before rising sea levels, drowned it around 8,000 years ago, was suspected partly because of folk traditions among North Sea fishing communities about a land that had been swallowed by the water. The traditions were not proof, but they were a direction to look, and looking in that direction turned out to be worthwhile. The oral traditions around Fuxian Lake are not proof of a sunken city, but they are, at minimum, a direction. They represent the accumulated observation of people who have lived beside this lake for a very long time, who have watched its waters, dived in them, fished them, and passed stories about them from parent to child across centuries. When those stories say that something is down there, it seems at least worth taking seriously enough to look. And looking, as Gengwei demonstrated in 1992, does produce something. The question is what exactly that something is, and whether the tools and the institutional will exist to answer it properly. The Dian Kingdom, then, stands as the most historically grounded candidate for the builders of whatever lies beneath Fuxian Lake. A Bronze Age civilization of demonstrated sophistication, operating in exactly this region, during exactly the period when the structures could plausibly have been built, with an unlocated capital that has never been found on land. It is a hypothesis that fits the available evidence without requiring any extraordinary claims. It does not demand that we accept a lost civilization older than Egypt, or a prehistoric culture of mysterious origin. It simply asks us to consider that a known historical civilization may have built its capital in a place that subsequently went underwater, and that what divers have been filming since 2001 may be what remains of that capital. That is a remarkable idea on its own terms without any embellishment. But remarkable ideas require remarkable evidence, and evidence, in the case of Fuxian Lake, has been frustratingly slow to accumulate. Part of the reason for that slowness lies in the geology of the region itself, in the specific mechanisms by which a city that once stood on dry land could end up 30 or 40 metres beneath the surface of a lake. Understanding how the submersion might have happened is not just a scientific footnote. It is central to understanding when it happened, and when it happened is central to identifying who was responsible. The Yunnan Plateau, beautiful and serene as it appears, sits on a geological foundation that is anything but stable, and the story of how Fuxian Lake came to be the shape and depth that it is today is a story that reaches down into the slow violence of the earth itself. So let us go beneath the surface, not into the geology yet, but into the water itself. Into what divers have actually seen and filmed and described when they descended into Fuxian Lake and looked around. Because before we can ask how the structures got there, or who built them, or when, we need to understand what they are. And that turns out to be a more complicated question than it might first appear. The documentation of the underwater structures at Fuxian Lake accumulated gradually across several years, beginning with Gengwei's early dives in the 1990s and expanding significantly after 2001, when he organised a larger team and brought underwater camera equipment into the lake for the first time. Between 2001 and 2006, multiple dive expeditions produced video footage and first-hand accounts that form the primary body of evidence for what lies on the lakebed. It is imperfect evidence, gathered under difficult conditions by teams that were enthusiastic but not always equipped with the kind of systematic methodology that professional underwater archaeology demands. But it is what exists, and it is worth examining carefully. The first thing to understand is the scale. The structures, or what appear to be structures, reportedly cover an area of approximately 2.5 square kilometres on the lakebed. That is not a small anomaly. That is not a single unusual rock formation or an isolated pile of stones that could easily be explained away. 2.5 square kilometres is roughly the size of several city blocks laid side by side, and the features described within that area are not uniform or simple. They appear, from the available footage and diver accounts, to represent something that had internal organisation, something that was arranged according to a plan. Within that area, divers have described large stone platforms, some of them reportedly exceeding 60 metres in width. To put that in perspective, 60 metres is roughly the length of 2 standard swimming pools placed end to end. These are not modest features. They are substantial horizontal surfaces of stone that sit flat against the lakebed, and their edges, from what the video footage suggests, appear to be defined rather than ragged. The kind of edge you get when stone has been cut or shaped, not the kind you get when rock has been fractured by geological force or worn smooth by water over millennia. Whether that visual impression holds up under rigorous analysis is one of the central questions that has never been formally answered, but it is what multiple independent observers have reported, and it is consistent across different dive accounts from different years. Beyond the platforms, divers have described what appear to be roads or pathways connecting different sections of the site. These are elongated flat surfaces, narrower than the platforms, running in relatively straight lines across the lakebed. Roads are, of course, one of the most diagnostic features of human settlement. They imply movement between places, which implies that the places between which movement was occurring had distinct functions. Markets, residences, temples, administrative buildings. A road does not exist in isolation. It exists because something was at each end of it worth travelling to. If what divers are seeing on the lakebed of Fuxian Lake are genuinely roads, then by implication they are seeing the connective tissue of a settlement that had internal geography, internal purpose, internal life. There are also stone walls, not continuous walls in every account, and not always clearly defined in the video footage that has been made available, but multiple divers have described vertical or near-vertical stone surfaces rising from the lakebed at angles that do not match what you would expect from natural rock formations. Stone walls, like roads, carry interpretive weight. A wall implies enclosure, which implies something worth enclosing. A wall implies construction, which implies builders, and a wall implies a moment in time when someone decided that this line, right here, was where one space ended and another began. Perhaps the most discussed single feature is a structure that has been described, in various accounts, as resembling a pyramid or a stepped platform. This is the feature that tends to generate the most excitement in media coverage of Fuxian Lake, and also the most caution from researchers who prefer not to use the word pyramid loosely. What divers appear to have documented is a structure that rises from the lakebed in a series of stepped levels, narrowing as it ascends, in a form that is broadly consistent with the stepped platforms found in many ancient cultures across Asia and the Americas. The Dian Kingdom, as it happens, did construct elevated ceremonial platforms as part of their architectural tradition, though none of their confirmed surviving structures are on quite the scale that some accounts of the Fuxian Lake feature suggest. At the top of this structure, one account describes an opening or hole approximately 3 meters wide, which has been interpreted variously as an entrance, a ritual feature, or simply a natural gap in the stone. 3 meters is wide enough for several people to pass through simultaneously, which, if intentional, suggests it was designed for use rather than merely for appearance. The stones themselves, in the footage that has been examined, appear to be cut and fitted rather than randomly deposited. This is a critical distinction, and it is worth spending a moment on what it means in practice. Natural geological processes can produce remarkably regular-looking rock formations. Columnar basalt, for instance, forms hexagonal columns so geometrically precise that they look almost machined. Limestone-cast landscapes can produce shapes that, from certain angles and in certain lighting conditions, resemble walls, arches, or platforms. The argument that the Fuxian Lake structures are natural formations is not an absurd one, and it has been made by credible geologists who have reviewed the available footage. What makes it difficult to accept as a complete explanation is the combination of features, not just one platform, not just one wall-like surface, but platforms and walls and pathways and a stepped structure, all in close proximity, all appearing to relate to each other spatially in ways that natural formations do not typically do. Natural processes produce individual impressive features. They do not, as a rule, produce what appears to be an organised spatial arrangement of multiple different feature types across 2.5 square kilometres. The water conditions in Fuxian Lake add another layer of complexity to any attempt to assess what is actually there. The lake's clarity, which is one of its most celebrated characteristics at the surface, does not translate uniformly to its depths. At the lakebed, where the structures sit at roughly 20 to 40 metres below the surface, in the areas that have been most extensively explored, visibility varies considerably depending on conditions. Water temperature at those depths is cold, typically around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius year-round, which is manageable for experienced divers with appropriate equipment, but adds physical stress that affects how long divers can stay down, and how carefully they can observe and document what they see. Cold, limited visibility, and the psychological pressure of being in an unfamiliar underwater environment do not make for ideal conditions for careful scientific observation. Divers in these conditions are working hard just to stay oriented and safe, which means that detailed examination of stone surfaces, measurement of angles, and systematic documentation of spatial relationships are all significantly harder than they would be in a controlled setting. This is part of why the absence of recovered artifacts is so significant and so frustrating. In all the dives conducted at Fuxian Lake between 1992 and the mid-2000s, no pottery, no tools, no inscriptions, no organic material, and no manufactured objects of any kind have been officially recovered from the structures themselves. This is not necessarily evidence that the structures are not man-made. Underwater sites can be stripped of portable artifacts by currents, by sediment movement, by the degradation of organic materials over centuries of submersion, or simply by the fact that the specific areas that have been explored happen not to be the areas where artifacts were concentrated. Port Royal in Jamaica, one of the best documented underwater archaeological sites in the world, yielded enormous quantities of artifacts when it was properly excavated, but only because systematic excavation was conducted with the specific goal of artifact recovery. The Fuxian Lake dives have been exploratory rather than excavatory. They have been aimed at documenting what is visible, not at carefully extracting and preserving what might be buried in the sediment around and beneath the visible features. But the absence of artifacts still matters, because artifacts are what turn an interesting visual observation into a confirmed archaeological site. Artifacts provide dates. They provide cultural identification. They tell you who made them and roughly when, and they establish beyond reasonable doubt that human beings were present and active in a specific location. Without artifacts, everything that divers have observed at Fuxian Lake remains in the category of suggestive but unconfirmed. The structures look like they might be man-made. They are arranged in ways that suggest human planning. But without something you can hold in your hand and date in a laboratory, the suggestion remains just that. There is also the question of what the structures do not show, or at least have not yet been documented as showing. In a typical ancient settlement, even a submerged one, you would expect to find evidence of everyday life distributed across the site. Hearths, or the remnants of them. Middens, which are essentially ancient rubbish heaps, and which are among the most archaeologically valuable features a site can contain because they preserve organic material in concentrated form. Post holes, where wooden structures once stood. Concentrations of broken pottery at the places where vessels were used and discarded. None of these features have been identified at Fuxian Lake, at least not in any documentation that has entered the public record. This could mean that the site has not been examined at the resolution needed to find them. It could mean that they are buried under sediment that the current dives have not penetrated. Or it could mean something more troubling for the man-made hypothesis, that the features on the lake bed are not the remains of a settlement at all, but something else entirely. What that something else might be is a question that geology is better equipped to address than archaeology, and it is a question worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as an inconvenient complication. The Yunnan Plateau is not geologically simple, and Fuxian Lake did not arrive at its current form by accident. The forces that shape the lake are the same forces that could, in theory, have produced the features on its lakebed without any human involvement whatsoever. Understanding those forces does not resolve the mystery of Fuxian Lake, but it does define the terms of the debate with considerably more precision than the excited media coverage of the site has typically managed. What the available evidence from the dives does establish fairly clearly is that something unusual is on the lakebed of Fuxian Lake, something that has a degree of regularity and spatial organisation that is at minimum worth serious scientific attention, whether that something is the remains of a dying kingdom city, the remnants of an older and as yet unidentified settlement, a natural geological formation that happens to resemble architecture with unusual fidelity, or some combination of natural and human features that has not yet been properly disentangled, cannot be determined from what has been documented so far. The dives have produced questions more reliably than they have produced answers, which is perhaps the most honest summary of where the evidence currently stands. And yet the questions themselves are not trivial. If the structures are man-made, and if they represent a settlement of the scale that the 2.5 square kilometre footprint suggests, then whatever lies beneath Fuxian Lake is not a minor historical footnote. It will be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Chinese history, and potentially in Asian history more broadly. A submerged city of that scale, associated with a known Bronze Age civilization operating in a tectonically active region, would transform our understanding of the Dian Kingdom and of the broader pattern of early urban development in the Yunnan Plateau. It would be, in a very real sense, a Chinese Atlantis, not in the mythological sense of a fantastically advanced civilization lost to divine punishment, but in the straightforward archaeological sense of a real city that was swallowed by water and preserved beneath it, waiting for the right combination of technology, resources and institutional will to bring it back into the light. That combination has not yet arrived at Fuxian Lake, but understanding why it has not and what it would actually take to resolve the question definitively requires understanding something that the dive footage alone cannot tell us. It requires understanding the ground beneath the lake, the faults and the forces that have been reshaping this part of the Yunnan Plateau for millions of years, and the specific mechanisms by which a city that once stood in open air could have descended to the cold and silent depths where Geng Wei first encountered it in the summer of 1992. To understand what the ground beneath Fuxian Lake has been doing, you first have to understand where the lake sits in the broader architecture of the Earth. The Yunnan Guizhou Plateau, which occupies much of southwestern China, is not a stable, settled piece of crust that has been sitting quietly in place for millions of years. It is, in geological terms, a contested zone. It sits at the eastern edge of the Great Collision between the Indian subcontinent and the Eurasian Plate, a collision that has been ongoing for roughly 50 million years and that has produced, among other things, the Himalayan mountain range to the northwest. The ripple effects of that collision extend far beyond the Himalayas themselves. They spread eastward and southward across the plateau, expressing themselves as faults, as uplift, as subsidence, and as seismic activity that continues to the present day. Yunnan province is one of the most seismically active regions in China. That is not a dramatic claim or an exaggeration. It is a simple geological fact, documented in both historical records and modern seismic monitoring data. The province experiences more earthquakes per unit area than almost any other part of the country, and has done so throughout recorded history. In 1833, a major earthquake struck near Kunming, the provincial capital, killing tens of thousands of people and reshaping the landscape around Dian Lake to the north. In 1970, the Tonghai earthquake in Yunnan killed more than 15,000 people. In 2014, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake struck Ludian County, again in Yunnan, causing widespread destruction. These are not isolated incidents. They are data points in a long and continuous record of seismic activity that stretches back well beyond the reach of written history. Fuxian Lake itself sits within this seismically active landscape in a very specific geological context. The lake occupies what geologists call a graben. The word comes from the German for ditch or trench, and the structure it describes is exactly that. A block of the Earth's crust that has dropped downward relative to the land on either side of it, pulled apart along two parallel fault lines. You can think of it like a keystone in an arch, except instead of being pushed upward by compression, it has been pulled downward by extension, leaving the surrounding terrain standing higher on both sides while the central block sinks. This is how rift valleys form, and it is how many of the world's deepest lakes have come to exist. Lake Baikal in Siberia, the deepest lake on Earth, sits in a graben. The East African rift lakes, including Tanganyika and Malawi, sit in grabens. And Fuxian Lake, with its exceptional depth of approximately 155 metres at its deepest point, sits in a graben carved by the same fundamental process. What this means for the question of how structures might have ended up on the lakebed is both illuminating and complicated. A graben is not a static feature. It does not drop once and then stop. It continues to subside over geological time, deepening gradually as the faults on either side remain active. The rate of subsidence varies enormously depending on the specific fault geometry, the regional stress field, and whether movement is occurring continuously or in discrete seismic events. In some graben systems, subsidence is slow enough to be essentially invisible on human timescales. In others, particularly those in seismically active regions, movement can be sudden and dramatic, occurring in minutes during a major earthquake rather than over centuries of gradual creep. The Yunnan Plateau, given its seismic history, is the kind of region where both modes of subsidence are plausible, and where a combination of the two over a long enough period of time could produce very significant changes in the elevation of the lakebed and the surrounding shoreline. The structures that divers have documented sit at depths ranging from roughly 20 to 40 metres below the current surface of the lake. That is not a trivial depth to explain. If those structures were built on dry land, or at the shoreline, or even in very shallow water, then something has to account for the fact that they are now sitting at depths where the water pressure is 2 to 4 times atmospheric pressure and where sunlight barely reaches. There are two broad categories of geological explanation for how this could have happened, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is gradual subsidence. If the floor of the graben has been sinking slowly over centuries or millennia, then a settlement built on the lakeshore at one point in history could have found itself progressively submerged as the land beneath it descended. This would not necessarily have been a dramatic event. A shoreline that drops by a metre per century is dropping fast enough in geological terms to be noticeable within a human lifetime, but slow enough that the people living near it might have adapted gradually, retreating from the water as it advanced, until eventually the structures they left behind were fully submerged. 20 to 40 metres of subsidence spread over 1,000 years would require a subsidence rate of roughly 2 to 4 centimetres per year, which is at the high end of what graben systems typically produce, but not outside the range of what has been documented in other tectonically active areas. The second explanation is more dramatic, and in some ways more consistent with the depth of the structures. A catastrophic seismic event, a large earthquake along one of the faults that bound the graben, could have caused rapid and significant subsidence of the lakebed or the surrounding shoreline in a matter of seconds or minutes. Historical records from other parts of the world document cases where earthquakes have caused land to drop by several meters in a single event. The 1964 Alaska earthquake, for example, caused parts of the coastline to subside by as much as 2 meters almost instantaneously. In 1819, an earthquake in the Rann of Kutch in India caused a large area of land to drop below sea level within hours, creating a new shallow lake. If a comparable event occurred in the Fuxian Lake basin at some point in the past, perhaps triggered by movement along the faults that define the Graben, it could have caused a previously inhabited shoreline area to drop rapidly beneath the lake surface. A settlement built on that shoreline would have been submerged not gradually but suddenly, which would also help explain why, if the structures are indeed man-made, there is no clear evidence that the inhabitants had time to remove their belongings before the water arrived. Historical Chinese records do document seismic events in Yunnan, though the written record becomes increasingly sparse as you go further back in time. The earliest detailed Chinese records of earthquakes in the region date to the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, and they describe significant seismic events affecting the Yunnan Plateau. Before that, the documentary record thins considerably, and for events older than about 2,500 years, there is essentially no written record at all from this part of China. This is a significant limitation, because if the structures at Fuxian Lake are associated with the Dian Kingdom, which flourished between roughly the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, then a seismic event capable of submerging a Dian settlement would need to have occurred sometime within or just after that period. There is no specific historical record of such an event at Fuxian Lake, but the absence of a record is not the same as evidence that the event did not happen. The written record of ancient Yunnan is fragmentary at best, and a regional disaster that did not directly affect the Han Dynasty heartland to the north might simply not have been documented in the sources that have survived. There is also a third geological factor worth considering, one that is less dramatic than a catastrophic earthquake, but potentially just as significant over long timescales. The water level of a lake is not fixed. It fluctuates in response to changes in precipitation, temperature, groundwater flow, and the balance between inflow and evaporation. Fuxian Lake is fed primarily by underground springs rather than by surface rivers, which makes its water level relatively stable compared to lakes that depend heavily on seasonal rainfall. But over centuries and millennia, even a spring-fed lake can experience significant changes in water level in response to broader climatic shifts. During drier periods, the lake level drops. During wetter periods, it rises. If a settlement was built on the lakeshore during a period of lower water levels and the climate subsequently became wetter, raising the lake level by 10 or 15 meters over the following centuries, structures that were originally on dry land could have become submerged without any seismic activity at all. This kind of lake-level change has been documented at other lakes in China and across Asia, and it represents a mechanism that is often overlooked in discussions of the Fuxian Lake structures, perhaps because it is less cinematically satisfying than a sudden earthquake, but no less geologically real. The honest answer is that geology can tell us, with reasonable confidence, that submersion of a shoreline settlement in the Fuxian Lake basin is physically plausible. The Graben setting, the seismic history of the region, and the potential for lake-level fluctuation all provide credible mechanisms by which structures built on dry land could have ended up at the depths, where divers have found them. What geology cannot tell us, at least not without considerably more detailed investigation of the specific fault geometry and the sediment record beneath the lakebed, is which of these mechanisms was actually responsible, or when the submersion occurred. And the timing, as it turns out, is not a secondary detail. It is the central question on which almost everything else depends. If the structures were submerged 2,000 years ago, during or just after the Dian Kingdom period, then they are consistent with what we know about the region's history and the kinds of settlements that the Dian people built. A Dian city submerged by a seismic event in the 1st century BCE or CE would be an extraordinary discovery, but it would be a discovery that fits within a historical framework we already understand in broad outline. If the structures were submerged 5,000 years ago, they would represent a pre-Dian civilization of considerable sophistication, one that is essentially unknown from any other source. And if they were submerged 10,000 years ago, as some of the more enthusiastic online accounts have claimed, then they would predate not only the Dian Kingdom but every other known complex society in the region by thousands of years, and would require a fundamental rethinking of the timeline of human civilization in East Asia. That claim, the 10,000-year claim, has no support in the peer-reviewed scientific literature and should be understood for what it is, a number that has been attached to the site because it sounds impressive and because it places the structures tantalizingly close to the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were rising globally and when real coastal settlements were indeed being submerged around the world. But Fuxian Lake is not a coastal site. It is an inland lake on a high plateau, and the mechanisms that submerged coastal settlements during the post-glacial sea level rise do not apply to it. The 10,000-year figure is not based on any measurement or analysis of the Fuxian Lake structures themselves. It is, to put it plainly, a guess dressed up as a fact, and it has done the site's credibility more harm than good by associating a genuinely interesting geological and archaeological puzzle with the kind of breathless speculation that serious researchers instinctively avoid. A more grounded estimate, based on the regional archaeological and historical record, would place the potential construction of any man-made structures in the area somewhere between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE. This is the window that encompasses the Dian Kingdom and the early centuries of Han Chinese influence in the region. It is also the window for which we have the richest archaeological context from nearby sites like Shijiaishan, where the bronze artifacts excavated between 1955 and 1960 provide a detailed picture of Dian material culture and social organisation. If the Fuxian Lake structures were built within this window and submerged by a seismic event or a period of rising lake levels sometime during or after it, then the depth of 20 to 40 metres is broadly consistent with the rates of geological change that have been documented elsewhere in the Yunnan Graben system. It is not a perfect fit, and it would require more detailed analysis to confirm, but it is at least a hypothesis that does not require us to invent civilizations for which there is no other evidence. What makes the geological question so frustrating and so important is that it is in principle answerable. Sediment cores taken from the lakebed could reveal the history of the lake's water level over thousands of years. Detailed seismic surveys of the faults that bound the Graben could constrain the timing and magnitude of past earthquakes. Underwater mapping using sonar and remotely operated vehicles could establish the precise geometry of the structures and compare it to the geometry of known natural geological features in the region. None of these investigations require heroic technology or unlimited funding. They require the kind of organised, methodical scientific effort that has been applied to dozens of underwater sites around the world. They require, in short, the institutional will to treat Fuxian Lake as a site worth understanding rather than a curiosity worth photographing. That institutional will has been slow to materialise, for reasons that are partly scientific, partly political, and partly a consequence of the way the site entered public consciousness. Because Fuxian Lake first became widely known through the claims of an amateur diver, rather than through a peer-reviewed publication, it arrived in the public imagination already carrying a certain weight of scepticism from the professional archaeological community. And because the subsequent media coverage, including the 2006 CCTV expedition, leaned heavily on the visual drama of the footage rather than on careful scientific analysis, the site became associated in many people's minds with the kind of sensational underwater mystery that belongs more to television than to scholarship. That association has made it harder, not easier, for serious researchers to engage with the question without feeling that they are somehow endorsing the more extravagant claims that have attached themselves to the site over the years. But the geological reality of Fuxian Lake does not care about its media reputation. The faults are real, the seismic history is real, the Graben is real. And whatever is sitting on the lakebed at depths between 20 and 40 metres is real, regardless of whether it was put there by human hands or by the slow, indifferent work of the Earth's interior. Geology defines the possible. It sets the boundaries within which any explanation for the Fuxian Lake structures must operate. And what it tells us, clearly and without ambiguity is that the submersion of a shoreline settlement in this basin is not just possible. It is exactly the kind of thing that the geological history of this region would lead you to expect. The question is not whether the lake could have swallowed something. The question is what, exactly, it swallowed, and when. Those are questions that geology alone cannot answer. For those, you need archaeology. And for archaeology to do its work at Fuxian Lake, you need something that has so far been in short supply. An official response from the institutions with the authority and the resources to conduct the kind of investigation the site deserves. That official response, when it came, arrived in the form of cameras and a broadcast deadline rather than trowels and sediment cores. In 2006, Chinese state television, the network known as CCTV, organised what was presented as a more systematic investigation of the Fuxian Lake structures. It was, by any measure, the most organised and most publicly visible effort to examine the site that had taken place since Gengwei first descended into those cold waters 14 years earlier. A team was assembled that included professional divers, camera operators, and, crucially, at least some involvement from people with archaeological and geological training. Equipment was brought in, dive plans were coordinated, and for a period of days the lake received the kind of sustained, organised attention that its most devoted advocates had been calling for since the early years of the previous decade. The footage that resulted was broadcast nationally, and for many viewers across China, it was their first real encounter with the Fuxian Lake mystery. Where previous video had been grainy and fragmentary, captured on whatever equipment Gengwei and his teams could manage during dives that were always improvised to some degree, the 2006 footage was clearer, steadier, and more deliberately composed. It showed stone surfaces that appeared flat and worked. It showed what looked like the edge of a large platform, its geometry too regular to dismiss without thought. It showed a section of what some divers described as a road or pathway, a long flat expanse of fitted stone running across the lakebed at a consistent width. And it showed the opening at the top of one of the larger structures, the circular or roughly circular hole approximately 3 meters across that had been mentioned in earlier dive reports, now visible on screen with enough clarity that viewers could form their own impressions. What those impressions were depended enormously on who was watching. For people who had already followed the story and were inclined to believe that the structures were man-made, the footage was confirmation. For professional archaeologists and geologists watching the same images, the reaction was considerably more measured, and it is worth spending some time with that measured reaction, because it was not simply dismissal. It was something more complicated and, in its way, more interesting than dismissal. The official response from Chinese archaeologists in the wake of the 2006 expedition was characterized above all by caution. Not the caution of people who had looked at the evidence and decided it was worthless, but the caution of people who had looked at the evidence and decided it was insufficient. There is a meaningful difference between those two positions, and the distinction matters for understanding where the Fuxian Lake question actually stands. Several archaeologists who commented publicly on the footage noted that the regularity of some stone arrangements was difficult to explain through purely natural processes. The flat surfaces, the apparent alignment of edges, the consistent angles in certain sections of what might be walls, these were features that gave even skeptical observers pause. They were not the kinds of features you would expect to see in a random scattering of geological debris. At the same time, those same archaeologists were careful to point out that regularity alone is not proof of human construction. Geology is capable of producing formations that look, to the untrained eye, remarkably architectural. Limestone karst landscapes, which are common across much of southern China and Southeast Asia, can produce flat-topped formations, stepped structures, and even what appear to be paved surfaces through entirely natural processes of dissolution, deposition, and fracturing along bedding planes. The Yunnan Plateau has its own distinctive geology, shaped by millions of years of tectonic activity, volcanic intrusion, and the chemical weathering of carbonate rock. It is a landscape that does not always play by the intuitive rules that a viewer accustomed to gentler terrain might expect. One explanation that several geologists offered in the years following the 2006 expedition was that the structures might represent natural fault-produced rock formations, blocks of stone that had been displaced and repositioned by seismic activity along the faults that bound the Fuxian Graben, then further shaped by the slow action of water over centuries. In this reading, the flat surfaces are joint planes within the rock, exposed by fracturing. The apparent walls are fault scarps or the edges of displaced blocks. The road-like surfaces are natural bedding planes that happen to be oriented horizontally. The stepped structure that some divers described as pyramid-like is a natural terracing produced by differential erosion of rock layers with different hardness. This explanation is plausible. It is not, however, entirely satisfying, and the archaeologists and geologists who proposed it generally acknowledged as much. The difficulty is that the natural explanation works well for some features and less well for others. The very large flat platforms, some reportedly extending more than 60 metres in width, are broadly consistent with natural geological formations in a tectonically active graben. But the apparent fitting of stone blocks, the consistent spacing of what look like structural elements, and especially the 3-metre opening at the top of the larger structure, are harder to account for through purely geological processes. A hole of that size and apparent regularity, positioned at the apex of an otherwise symmetrical formation, does not have an obvious natural analogue in the geological literature for this type of environment. What the 2006 expedition ultimately produced then was not a resolution, but a sharpening of the question. It established more clearly than any previous investigation what the structures looked like, and it surfaced the specific features that were most difficult to explain in either purely natural or purely human terms. It also, perhaps inadvertently, revealed the limits of what video footage alone can tell you. You can watch a stone surface on a screen for as long as you like, and it will not tell you whether the marks on it were made by a chisel or by a fault. It will not tell you whether the flat plane you are looking at was worked smooth by human hands or exposed smooth by the dissolution of overlying material. It will not tell you the age of the rock, the history of its position, or the sequence of events that brought it to its current location. For those answers, you need physical samples. You need instruments in contact with the material itself. You need the kind of investigation that a camera, however well operated, cannot perform. And this is where the most consequential detail of the 2006 expedition becomes relevant. Despite the involvement of trained professionals, despite the national broadcast, and despite the genuine public interest the footage generated, the expedition did not result in the recovery of any physical samples from the structures. No sediment cores were taken from the lakebed near the formations. No material was removed for laboratory analysis. No systematic grid mapping of the site was completed. The expedition was, in archaeological terms, observational rather than investigative. It looked. It did not dig, and it did not measure in the systematic way that would have allowed the observations to be placed in a scientific framework that other researchers could build on. This is not a criticism that applies only to the 2006 team. It reflects a broader and more structural problem with the site's status. In China, as in most countries, formal underwater archaeological excavation requires official designation of a site as an archaeological resource, which triggers a set of legal protections and creates the institutional framework within which excavation can be authorized, funded, and conducted. Without that designation, even researchers who wanted to conduct a proper excavation would face significant barriers. They could not legally remove material from the site. They could not apply for the kind of institutional funding that serious fieldwork requires. They could not publish results in peer-reviewed journals in a way that would be recognised as authoritative, because their work would lack the official standing that the academic community expects. The Chinese government, as of the time of writing, has not officially designated the Fuxian Lake underwater structures as an archaeological site. The reasons for this are not entirely transparent, but they are not difficult to infer. Designating a site as an archaeological resource carries obligations. It requires the government to protect the site from damage, to fund or authorise investigation, and to manage public access in ways that can be administratively and financially demanding. It also carries a degree of implicit acknowledgement that the site is significant, which in a case like Fuxian Lake, where the significance is still genuinely uncertain, may feel premature to officials who are accustomed to making decisions on the basis of established evidence rather than unresolved questions. There is also a subtler dynamic at work. The Fuxian Lake story, as it has developed in the Chinese public imagination, has acquired associations that some official bodies may find uncomfortable. The more extravagant versions of the story, the ones that place the structures at 10,000 years of age and describe them as the remains of a lost civilization of extraordinary sophistication, have circulated widely online and in popular media. These versions draw on a broader tradition of popular archaeology that tends toward the spectacular and the conspiratorial, and that sometimes carries implications, whether intended or not, that challenge official historical narratives. For government bodies responsible for managing China's cultural heritage, a story that has become entangled with this kind of speculation may be one that is easier to leave in ambiguity than to engage with directly. The result is a situation that serves no one particularly well. The site exists in a kind of institutional limbo, studied enough to be famous but not protected enough to be safe, discussed enough to generate public interest but not investigated enough to resolve the questions that interest generates. Geng Wei has continued to dive in the lake and to advocate publicly for more systematic investigation. Independent researchers in China and abroad have continued to analyse the available footage and to write about the site in popular publications. But the organised, funded, peer-reviewed archaeological investigation that would actually move the question forward has not happened. What the 2006 CCTV expedition did accomplish, and this is not nothing, was to bring the question to a national audience in a format that was at least partially grounded in the involvement of trained professionals. It moved the conversation, however slightly, away from pure amateur enthusiasm and towards something that resembled a genuine scientific debate. The footage it produced remains the best visual documentation of the structures that exists. The cautious statements from archaeologists that accompanied the broadcast established a tone of careful uncertainty that was, in its way, more honest than either confident confirmation or confident dismissal would have been. And the public interest it generated created a context in which the question of Fuxian Lake could not easily be ignored, even if it could not yet be answered. There is something quietly instructive in the gap between what the 2006 expedition produced and what it could have produced with a different mandate and a different level of institutional commitment. The technology needed to conduct a proper underwater archaeological survey of Fuxian Lake was not exotic in 2006 and is even more accessible now. Remotely operated vehicles capable of high-resolution imaging and sediment sampling have been used at underwater sites around the world, including sites far more remote and far more technically challenging than a lake in Yunnan province. Sonar mapping systems capable of producing detailed three-dimensional models of the lakebed are standard equipment for serious underwater archaeology. The analytical techniques needed to date the structures, or at least to constrain the range of possible dates, are well established. None of this requires waiting for technology that does not yet exist. It requires the decision to apply technology that does. That decision, as of now, has not been made, and so the structures sit where they have always sat, in the cold and the dark at the bottom of one of the deepest lakes in Asia, as patient as stone tends to be. The CCTV cameras have gone home, the divers have surfaced, the footage has been watched and debated and watched again. And the question of what those formations are, who made them if anyone did, and what story they might tell about the people who once lived on the shore of this lake, remains as open as it was when Geng Wei first surfaced in 1992 and tried to explain to people what he had seen down there. What the official response ultimately revealed, more than anything else, was the shape of the problem. This is not a mystery that lacks evidence. It is a mystery that lacks the institutional framework to interpret the evidence it has. The footage exists. The structures exist. The geological context is documented. The regional archaeological record is rich enough to provide meaningful comparisons. What does not yet exist is the organised scientific effort that would bring all of these elements together in a way that produces conclusions rather than questions. And until that effort materialises, the debate will continue to circle the same points, the same footage, the same cautious statements, and the same frustrating absence of the one thing that would actually resolve it. Because what Fuxian Lake needs is not another camera. It needs someone willing to reach down and touch the stone, to take a sample, to run the analysis, and to publish what they find wherever that finding leads. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about the oral traditions that have surrounded this lake for generations is that the people who carry them never needed any of that. They already knew something was down there. They had always known. The question of what to call it and how to prove it, that was always going to be someone else's problem, and that in a way is where the story becomes something older and quieter than any expedition report or broadcast documentary could quite capture. Because long before Gengwei lowered himself into the water for the first time, long before a camera was ever pointed at the lakebed, long before anyone used the word archaeology in connection with Fuxian Lake at all, there were people living on its shores who had their own understanding of what the water held. Not a scientific understanding, not one that could be written up and submitted to a journal, but an understanding nonetheless. One that had been carried carefully from generation to generation, passed through the kind of slow, patient transmission that does not require paper or ink or institutional support. Just memory and the willingness to keep telling the story. The Yi people are one of the largest ethnic minority groups in China, with a population of several million spread across Yunnan, Sichuan, Guizhou and Guangxi provinces. In Yunnan, they have been present for a very long time, long enough that their oral traditions about the landscape around them carry layers of accumulated memory that are difficult to date but impossible to dismiss entirely. The Yi communities that have historically lived around the shores of Fuxian Lake do not describe the lake simply as a body of water. They describe it as a place with a history beneath its surface, a place where something was lost. The tradition that gets mentioned most often in connection with the underwater structures is the story of a city, sometimes referred to in accounts as Yu Yuan, a name that translates roughly to something like Jade Garden or Jade Source, depending on the interpretation, though the exact name varies between different tellings and different sources. The details of the story also vary, as oral traditions always do across time and geography. But the core of it is consistent enough to be worth paying attention to. The city was prosperous. It had markets and temples and roads. People lived there in numbers, traded there, worshipped there, and then, at some point, it went beneath the water. Some versions of the story describe the submersion as gradual, a slow encroachment of the lake over many generations, the kind of change that people would have noticed and remembered and eventually folded into legend as the scale of it became clear. Other versions describe something more sudden and more catastrophic, an earthquake, a great flood, a rupture in the earth that swallowed the city quickly enough that it became a disaster story, rather than a slow-moving historical process. The details of the catastrophe differ. The fact of the submersion does not. In both kinds of telling, the city went down and the lake closed over it, and what remained was the water and the memory of what had been underneath. It would be easy, and in some ways tempting, to treat this as simply a good story. Sunken city legends are not rare. They appear in cultures across the world with a regularity that might suggest more about the universal human tendency to project loss onto deep water than about any specific geological event. Every civilization that has lived near a large body of water seems, at some point, to have developed a story about something that was swallowed by it. The ocean swallowed Atlantis. The sea swallowed Wheeze. The flood took everything. Water is the oldest metaphor for forgetting, and sunken city stories are, at least in part, a way of giving that forgetting a specific address. But the more careful scholars of oral tradition have argued for decades, with growing persuasiveness, that this kind of dismissal is too quick. The relationship between oral tradition and geological or historical reality is more complicated and more interesting than a simple binary between factual record and poetic invention. What oral traditions often preserve, even when they have accumulated layers of metaphor and embellishment over time, is a core of genuine geographic and historical memory. The story may not be literally true in every detail, but something in it is usually pointing at something real. The most famous example is Troy. For most of the 19th century, the Trojan War was treated by educated European scholars as a literary invention, a myth with no more historical basis than the stories of Hercules or Achilles. It was Homer's poetry, beautiful and important, but not a record of real events. Then, in the 1870s, Heinrich Schliemann, guided in part by his conviction that Homer was describing real places, excavated at Izarlik in modern-day Turkey, and found the remains of a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over thousands of years. The debate about exactly which layer corresponds to the city in the Iliad continues, and Schliemann's methods were far from impeccable, but the fundamental point stands. The oral tradition was pointing at something real. The story was not invented from nothing. A more recent and perhaps more directly relevant example is Doggerland, the now submerged landmass that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. As sea levels rose after the last ice age, Doggerland was gradually inundated, a process that took thousands of years but was still within the living memory of the populations who experienced it. Some researchers have argued that the flood myths preserved in the oral traditions of northern European cultures, including stories of great inundations and lost lands, may carry echoes of the actual experience of watching Doggerland disappear beneath the North Sea. The stories are not maps, but they are not entirely fiction either. They are the residue of lived experience, compressed and transformed by time into something that looks like legend, but still carries the shape of what happened. The Yi traditions about a sunken city at Fuxian Lake belong to this same category of evidence, not proof, but not nothing. A story specific enough to a specific place that it deserves to be taken seriously as a data point, even while being held at the appropriate distance from anything that could be called confirmation. The story names the lake. It describes a city with specific features, markets, temples, roads. It provides an explanation for how the city was lost. These are the kinds of details that tend to survive in oral tradition when they are attached to real places and real events, because specificity is what makes a story worth remembering and worth passing on. The Pu people, an older ethnic group whose presence in the Yunnan region predates many of the better documented historical populations, also carry traditions connected to the lake. The Pu are sometimes considered among the earliest inhabitants of the Yunnan plateau, and their oral traditions are correspondingly deep, though they are also among the least well documented by outside researchers. What survives of their connection to Fuxian Lake in the ethnographic record is fragmentary, but it is consistent with the broader pattern. The lake is not simply a geographical feature in these traditions, it is a place with a remembered human past, a past that includes something that was lost when the water rose or the earth shifted. What is interesting, and what the more careful researchers have noted, is that these traditions do not exist in isolation. Similar oral accounts of sunken settlements appear in other parts of Yunnan, and the pattern extends beyond Yunnan into other parts of Southeast Asia, where geological activity and changing water levels have shaped the landscape over millennia in ways that would have been directly experienced by the populations living through those changes. The specificity of the Fuxian Lake traditions, the fact that they point to this particular lake and describe features that broadly match what divers have reported seeing, is not something that can be explained away simply by invoking the general human tendency to tell stories about sunken things. If the tradition were purely metaphorical, there would be no particular reason for it to describe this lake rather than any other. or to describe the kinds of architectural features, roads, platforms, temples that correspond to what the underwater footage appears to show. There is also something worth noting about what the traditions do not claim. They do not describe a civilization of impossible sophistication. They do not attribute the city to supernatural builders or to visitors from elsewhere. The city in the Yi tradition is a human city, built by people, lived in by people, and lost to geological forces that are, in the context of what we know about the region, entirely plausible. This is the kind of oral tradition that tends to carry the most historical weight, not the grandiose version that reaches for the extraordinary, but the modest version that describes something ordinary being overtaken by something powerful. A prosperous place, markets and temples and roads, swallowed by the water. That is a story that could be told about 100 real places in human history. The question is whether it is being told about this one for a reason. The challenge, of course, is the same challenge that faces every attempt to use oral tradition as evidence for archaeological claims. Oral traditions change over time. They absorb influences from neighbouring cultures. They get attached to places for reasons that have more to do with the needs of the community telling them than with historical accuracy. A tradition that is 300 years old is not the same as one that is 3,000 years old, and distinguishing between them from the outside is genuinely difficult. Without independent corroboration, an oral tradition can point in a direction but cannot confirm a destination. What oral traditions can do, and what the Fuxian Lake traditions arguably do, is provide a kind of convergence. When the story told by the people who have lived beside the lake for generations aligns with the geological evidence for significant tectonic activity in the region, and with the visual evidence from underwater footage that shows what appear to be structured formations on the lakebed, and with the historical record of a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that existed in this region and whose capital has never been definitively located, the alignment itself becomes significant. None of these lines of evidence taken alone is sufficient, but they are pointing in the same direction, and when multiple independent sources of information converge on the same general conclusion, that convergence is worth taking seriously, even in the absence of the physical proof that would make the conclusion definitive. There is something quietly moving about the position that the Yi and Pu communities occupy in this story. They have lived beside this lake for generations, carrying in their oral traditions a memory of something that modern science is only beginning to tentatively confirm might actually be there. They did not need an expedition. They did not need a camera. They did not need a debate about whether the stone formations are natural or man-made. They already had an answer, or at least a story, and they had been keeping it safe in the only way available to them, by telling it again and again, generation after generation, in the way that human beings have always kept the most important things from being forgotten. That is not the same as saying the story is correct in every detail. It is saying that the story is serious, that it deserves the same careful attention that a piece of carved stone or a fragment of pottery would receive in a properly conducted archaeological investigation. Evidence comes in different forms. Some of it is physical and can be dated and analysed. Some of it is narrative and can only be interpreted. Both kinds matter. Both kinds, when they align, become more than the sum of their parts. And so the oral tradition of a sunken city at Fuxian Lake sits alongside the dive reports and the footage, and the geological surveys and the cautious statements from archaeologists as one more piece of a puzzle that has not yet been fully assembled. It does not resolve the question, but it deepens it. It reminds us that this is not a mystery that began with Gangwei's first dive in 1992. It is a mystery that has been recognised in its own way for far longer than that. The lake has always known. The people beside it have always known, or at least suspected, or at least told a story that was specific enough and persistent enough to suggest they were remembering something rather than inventing it. The question of when exactly that something happened, when the city, if it was a city, went beneath the water, is one that the oral tradition cannot answer with any precision. It can tell us that the event was significant enough to be remembered. It cannot tell us whether it happened 500 years ago or 5,000. And that question, the question of timing, turns out to be one of the most difficult and most consequential questions in the entire Fuxian Lake story. Because the age of the structures is not just a matter of historical curiosity, it is the key to almost everything else. It determines who might have built them, what civilization they might have belonged to, and what their existence would mean for our understanding of the ancient history of this part of the world. So let us sit with that question for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing mention. The age of the Fuxian Lake structures is not simply an interesting detail to be filled in later. It is the load-bearing wall of the entire mystery. Everything else, the identity of the builders, the significance of the site, the relationship between the structures and the known civilizations of the Yunnan Plateau, the meaning of the oral traditions, all of it rests on the answer to a single question that, so far, nobody has been able to answer with any confidence. When were these structures built, and when did they go beneath the water? In most archaeological contexts, this would be a difficult but ultimately solvable problem. Archaeology has developed a remarkable set of tools for establishing the age of things. Carbon-14 dating, which measures the decay of a radioactive isotope in organic material, can give reliable dates for objects up to roughly 50,000 years old. Dendrochronology, the analysis of tree rings preserved in ancient timber, can date wooden structures with extraordinary precision, sometimes to within a single year. Stratigraphy, the study of the layered deposits of soil and sediment that accumulate over time, allows archaeologists to establish the relative age of objects based on how deep they are buried and what they are buried alongside. Thermoluminescence dating can establish when certain minerals were last exposed to heat. Optically stimulated luminescence can date when sediment grains were last exposed to light. These are not exotic or experimental techniques. They are the standard tools of the discipline, used routinely on sites around the world to establish timelines that are reliable enough to be published, peer-reviewed, and built upon. The problem at Fuxian Lake is that almost none of these tools can be applied without physical access to the site, and physical access to the site in any meaningful scientific sense has not happened. To carbon date a structure, you need organic material from that structure, a piece of wood, a fragment of charcoal, a seed, a bone, something that was once alive and can now be measured for its remaining carbon-14 content. Stone itself cannot be carbon dated. The minerals that make up a stone block do not contain the organic carbon that the technique requires. So the stone walls and platforms on the Fuxian Lake bed, even if they are unambiguously man-made, cannot be dated directly. Only if organic material were found in direct physical association with the structures, embedded in mortar, trapped beneath a foundation stone, preserved in sediment that had accumulated against a wall, could a reliable date be established, and no such material has been officially recovered from the Fuxian Lake site. This is not a minor technical inconvenience, it is the central obstacle. Without organic material, without sediment cores taken from the lake bed in a controlled and systematic way, without the kind of careful stratigraphic analysis that would allow researchers to understand the sequence of events that led to the structures being where they are, the question of age remains entirely open. And an entirely open question, in the absence of the kind of institutional research that might begin to close it, tends to get filled in by whoever is most eager to fill it. Some researchers have attempted to estimate the age of the structures indirectly, working from what is known about the geological history of the region and the depth at which the structures currently sit. The logic runs roughly as follows. If the structures are located at a certain depth below the current lake surface, and if we know something about the rate at which the lake level has changed over time, or the rate at which the land in this tectonically active region has subsided, then we might be able to work backward to a rough estimate of when the structures were at or near the surface. This is not an unreasonable approach in principle. Geologists and archaeologists use similar reasoning at other submerged sites around the world. The challenge is that it requires reliable data about the geological history of the specific location, and that data, for Fuxian Lake, is limited and not without its own uncertainties. The estimates that have circulated in connection with the Fuxian Lake structures range so widely that they are almost more revealing for what they tell us about the uncertainty than for what they tell us about the actual age. On one end of the spectrum, some researchers have suggested that the structures could be relatively recent in archaeological terms, perhaps from the Ming Dynasty period, which would place them somewhere between the 14th and 17th centuries CE, or from the Han Dynasty era, which would place them between roughly 200 BCE and 200 CE. This range is actually consistent with the known history of the region. The Dian Kingdom, which flourished in Yunnan during the Han period, was a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization capable of large-scale construction, and the archaeological record from sites like Shizaishan near the lake demonstrates that complex organised society existed in this exact area during that time. A structure built during the Dian Kingdom period and subsequently submerged by tectonic activity or gradual lake level rise would be historically significant but not inexplicable. It would fit within the known framework of regional history. On the other end of the spectrum, some accounts, particularly those that circulate online and in popular media, have attached dates to the Fuxian Lake structures that are in a different category entirely. The figure of 10,000 years appears with some regularity in discussions of the site, and occasionally even older estimates have been suggested. A structure 10,000 years old would predate the Dian Kingdom by roughly 8,000 years. It would predate the earliest known written records from anywhere in China by several thousand years. It would be contemporaneous with the very earliest phases of the Neolithic transition in parts of the world, the period when human societies were just beginning to move from hunter-gatherer lifestyles towards settled agriculture. A confirmed man-made structure of that age in Yunnan would not simply be an interesting regional discovery. It would be one of the most significant archaeological finds in human history, requiring a fundamental revision of our understanding of when and where complex construction first emerged. And that is precisely why the 10,000-year claim demands to be treated with great caution. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as the principle goes, and the evidence for an age of 10,000 years at Fuxian Lake does not exist in any peer-reviewed, systematically gathered, or independently verified form. The figure appears to have originated in popular accounts and enthusiast publications rather than in scientific literature, and it has been repeated often enough to take on a life of its own, circulating through documentaries and websites with a confidence that the underlying evidence does not support. This is not to say the claim is impossible. It is to say that possibility and evidence are different things, and that treating a speculative estimate as established fact is one of the ways that genuinely interesting sites get tangled up in claims that make serious researchers reluctant to engage with them. The more cautious and more defensible estimate, based on the regional historical record and the geological context, would place potential construction somewhere in the range of 200 BCE to 500 CE. This is a wide window, but it's a window grounded in what we actually know about the region. It corresponds to the period of the Dian Kingdom and the early centuries following its incorporation into the Han Dynasty, a period when organised, hierarchically complex society, with the capacity for large-scale construction, was demonstrably present in this part of Yunnan. It is a period for which we have physical evidence from nearby excavated sites. It is a period that aligns reasonably well with the geological possibility of subsequent submersion through tectonic activity. It is not a glamorous estimate. It does not carry the same weight as 10,000 years. But it is the kind of estimate that a careful historian or archaeologist would be willing to defend, because it is built on things we actually know, rather than on things we would find exciting if they were true. There is something worth pausing on here, which is the way that the uncertainty around dating functions differently in different contexts. In a properly funded, institutionally supported archaeological investigation, uncertainty is a starting point. You acknowledge what you do not know, you design research to reduce that uncertainty. You gather evidence, you publish findings, you invite critique, and you refine your conclusions. Uncertainty is the engine of the process, not a barrier to it. But in the absence of that institutional framework, uncertainty functions very differently. It becomes a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. When nobody with the resources and the authority to do systematic research is doing systematic research, the space gets occupied by estimates that are more dramatic, more appealing, and more shareable than the careful hedged conclusions that actual evidence supports. This is not unique to Fuxian Lake. It is a pattern that appears wherever genuinely interesting sites remain outside the mainstream of archaeological investigation. The particular cruelty of the dating problem at Fuxian Lake is that it is not technically unsolvable. It is institutionally unsolved, which is a different thing. The tools exist, the methods are established. A properly equipped team with the right permissions, the right equipment, and the right scientific protocols could, in principle, conduct the kind of systematic underwater survey that would begin to answer the dating question. Sediment cores taken from the lakebed near the structures could potentially yield organic material for radiocarbon dating. Careful stratigraphic analysis of the sediment layers overlying and surrounding the structures could establish a relative chronology. If any organic material is preserved within the structures themselves, whether in gaps between stones or in associated deposits, it could be sampled and dated. None of this is beyond the capability of modern underwater archaeology. The field has made extraordinary progress in recent decades, developing techniques specifically designed for the challenges of submerged sites. What is required is not a technological breakthrough. What is required is the institutional decision to treat the site as worthy of that investment. Until that decision is made, the dating question will remain open, and the range of estimates will remain wide enough to accommodate almost any interpretation. This is frustrating for the people who take the site seriously on scientific grounds. It is frustrating for the local communities whose oral tradition suggests something real is being remembered. And it is, in a quieter way, frustrating for the site itself, if we can speak of a site having interests, because a site whose age is unknown is a site whose significance cannot be established, and a site whose significance cannot be established is a site that is easy to overlook, easy to delay, easy to leave for another year and then another decade and then another generation. What the dating question ultimately reveals is the extent to which the Fuxian Lake mystery is not primarily a mystery about the distant past. It is a mystery about the present. It is a mystery about who decides which sites deserve investigation, which questions deserve resources, which pieces of the human story are worth the effort and the cost of recovering. The structures on the lakebed have been there for however long they have been there. They are not going anywhere, at least not quickly. But the conditions that make them accessible and investigable are not static. The lake is not static. The sediment that accumulates over the structures with each passing year is not static. The water quality, the political context, the institutional priorities, all of these things change. And each year that passes without systematic investigation is a year in which the answers become slightly harder to reach. The age of the Fuxian Lake structures is unknown. That is the honest summary. Not approximately known, not roughly estimated, but genuinely, consequentially unknown, in a way that shapes everything else about how the site is understood and discussed. Whether the structures were built 2,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, or, as some have claimed, 10,000 years ago, the answer would transform the meaning of what lies on that lakebed. And without the answer, the mystery remains suspended in a kind of permanent present tense, examined but not understood, documented but not dated, significant but not confirmed. That suspension, that state of being known but not understood, is in many ways the defining condition of the Fuxian Lake site. And it makes the natural next question an obvious one. If the tools to date these structures exist, and if other submerged sites around the world have been successfully investigated using those tools, then what does the broader record of underwater archaeology tell us about what is possible? Because Fuxian Lake is not the only place in the world where the water has swallowed something that people once built and lived in. It is not even the most dramatic example. There are sites on other continents, in other seas and lakes and harbours where the water has preserved the evidence of human construction in ways that have allowed archaeologists to do exactly what has not yet been done at Fuxian Lake, to date, to excavate, to confirm, to understand. And looking at those sites, at what was found and how it was found and what the process of finding it actually required, tells us something important about what would need to happen for the Fuxian Lake mystery to move from the realm of compelling possibility into the realm of established fact. There is a place off the southern coast of Greece, near a small peninsula called Laconia, where the seafloor holds an entire town. Not fragments of a town, not scattered stones that might once have been walls, but streets, houses, courtyards, a central square, and what appear to be the remains of a harbour installation, all of it sitting in roughly 3 to 4 metres of water, preserved with a clarity that still surprises the researchers who have worked there. The site is called Pavlopetri, and it is one of the oldest known submerged towns on Earth. Surveys conducted using modern three-dimensional scanning technology have mapped an area of approximately 30,000 square metres, revealing a settlement that was occupied from at least 2800 BCE and possibly as early as 3500 BCE. That makes it roughly contemporaneous with the early Bronze Age civilizations of the Aegean, and it was a real, functioning community. Not a ceremonial site, not a fortress, but a place where people woke up in the morning, walked to the market, repaired their boats, and argued about the price of things. It sank gradually as the land beneath it subsided over centuries, and the sea moved in slowly enough that the layout of the streets was preserved almost intact. Archaeologists from the University of Nottingham and the Hellenic Ephorate of Underwater Antiquities have conducted systematic excavations there since 2009, recovering pottery, tools, and organic material that has allowed precise dating. The site is confirmed. The age is established. The community it once held is understood in reasonable detail. That is what systematic underwater archaeology looks like when it is actually done. Pavlopetri is useful to think about in the context of Fuxian Lake, not because the two sites are identical, they are not, but because Pavlopetri demonstrates something important. Submerged settlements are real. They exist. The sea and the lake do not simply destroy everything they swallow. Under the right conditions, stone structures can survive for thousands of years beneath the water, and the evidence preserved alongside them can be recovered and interpreted. The fact that Pavlopetri was eventually confirmed as a genuine Bronze Age town did not happen because someone looked at it from a boat and decided it was probably real. It happened because people got into the water with the right equipment, the right methods, and the institutional backing to do the work properly. That is the gap between Pavlopetri and Fuxian Lake, and it is not a small gap. Moving to the Indian subcontinent, there is another submerged site that invites comparison, though it also invites caution, because it sits in a more contested space between confirmed archaeology and ongoing debate. In the Gulf of Kambat, off the western coast of India, a team from India's National Institute of Ocean Technology reported in 2001 that sonar surveys had detected what appeared to be large, geometric structures on the seabed at a depth of approximately 30 to 40 metres. The structures covered a considerable area, and the team recovered some artefacts from the site using a dredge, including what was reported to be a piece of wood that was subsequently dated by radiocarbon analysis to approximately 9,500 years ago. This date was cited by some researchers as evidence that the Gulf of Kambat structures represented a city of extraordinary antiquity, a settlement that would predate the earliest known urban civilizations by several thousand years. The site was quickly associated with the legendary city of Dwarka, a place of considerable religious and cultural significance in Hindu tradition, and the claims attracted enormous attention both within India and internationally. What followed was instructive and not entirely comfortable. The radiocarbon date was contested almost immediately by other archaeologists, who pointed out that the wood fragment had been recovered by dredging, not by controlled excavation, meaning there was no way to establish with confidence that it was actually associated with the structures rather than simply present in the same general area of seabed. The dredging method itself was criticised as unsuitable for archaeological recovery because it cannot establish context, it cannot distinguish between material from different layers or periods, and it risks mixing artefacts from entirely unrelated deposits. Other researchers questioned whether the sonar images actually showed man-made structures at all, suggesting that what was visible might be natural geological formations. The debate has not been fully resolved, and the Gulf of Kambat site remains a subject of genuine scholarly disagreement. Some researchers continue to argue that the structures are real and significant. Others remain unconvinced that the evidence meets the standard required to confirm a submerged settlement of that age. What is clear is that a single radiocarbon date obtained from a dredged wood fragment, without controlled excavation and stratigraphic context, is not sufficient to establish the age or the nature of a submerged site. The Dwarka debate is a cautionary tale as much as it is an inspiring one, and it is directly relevant to Fuxian Lake, where the temptation to reach for dramatic age estimates without adequate evidentiary support has been just as present. Port Royal in Jamaica offers a different kind of comparison, one where the circumstances of submersion are unusually well documented and the archaeological work has been correspondingly thorough. Port Royal was a prosperous and notoriously lively port town on the southern coast of Jamaica, described in its heyday during the latter half of the 17th century as one of the busiest trading ports in the Caribbean. On the 7th of June, 1692, a powerful earthquake struck the island. The shaking lasted less than 2 minutes, but in that time approximately 2/3 of Port Royal slid into the sea. The liquefaction of the sandy ground beneath the town caused entire streets and buildings to simply drop into the harbour. Around 2,000 people died immediately, and the town that remained above water was badly damaged. What sank is now preserved in the shallow waters of Kingston Harbour at depths ranging from roughly 1 to 10 metres, and archaeological excavations conducted since the 1950s, with major work carried out by teams from Texas A&M University from the 1980s onward, have recovered thousands of artefacts including intact buildings, furniture, food remains, personal possessions, and even a watch whose hands stopped at 17 minutes to 12, presumably the moment it entered the water. Port Royal is, in archaeological terms, a remarkable site precisely because its date of submersion is known to the day, and the material it contains reflects a specific historical moment frozen in time. Port Royal is relevant to Fuxian Lake for a reason that might seem counterintuitive at first. The Jamaica site demonstrates what becomes possible when a submerged site has a confirmed date of submersion and an associated historical record. The combination of documentary evidence, physical artefacts, and stratigraphic context allows archaeologists to build an extraordinarily detailed picture of life in a specific place at a specific moment. Fuxian Lake has none of those advantages. There is no historical record that clearly describes a settlement being submerged beneath the lake. There are no artefacts with inscriptions or decorative styles that can be attributed to a known period. There is no confirmed date of submersion. Port Royal shows what the best case looks like, and it underscores how far Fuxian Lake is from that best case, not because the site is less interesting, but because the investigative work that would establish the necessary context simply has not been done. The Yonaguni Monument, located off the southern tip of Japan's Yonaguni Island in the East China Sea, is perhaps the most directly comparable site to Fuxian Lake, in terms of the debate it has generated and the frustrating inconclusiveness of that debate. The monument is a large underwater rock formation discovered by a diver named Kiichiro Arataki in 1986. It consists of a series of flat terraces, sharp angles, and what appear to be steps and platforms, all carved or formed in sandstone at depths of between 5 and 40 metres. The structure is visually striking, and photographs of it circulated widely in the years following its discovery, generating substantial public interest and claims that it represented a lost civilization of extraordinary antiquity. Some researchers argued that the Yonaguni monument was a man-made structure, possibly a ceremonial site or a pyramid, built during a period when sea levels were lower and the area was above water, which would place its construction at roughly 10,000 years ago during the last ice age. Others, including prominent geologists, argued that the structure was entirely natural, the result of the way sandstone fractures along regular planes and angles when subjected to tectonic stress and erosion, and that the apparent regularity of its features was a product of the rock's natural properties rather than human intervention. The Yonaguni debate has continued for nearly 4 decades without resolution, and the reason it has not been resolved is familiar. There has been no systematic archaeological excavation of the site. No artefacts have been recovered from it that can be definitively attributed to human activity. No organic material has been found in direct association with the structure that would allow radiocarbon dating. The debate has proceeded almost entirely on the basis of visual inspection and the interpretation of photographs and video footage, which is precisely the evidentiary situation at Fuxian Lake. Geologist Robert Schoch, who has written about both Yonaguni and other contested ancient sites, has argued that the monument shows features consistent with natural formation, particularly the way sandstone behaves along fault lines and bedding planes. Other researchers have pointed to specific features, including what they describe as a stone pillar and a carved human face, as evidence of human modification. Neither side has been able to produce the kind of direct physical evidence that would settle the question. The structural parallel with Fuxian Lake is almost exact. Both sites have been documented on video. Both have generated significant public interest. Both have attracted claims ranging from the cautiously intriguing to the wildly speculative, and neither has been subjected to the kind of systematic investigation that would allow the debate to move beyond its current state. What separates the confirmed sites from the unconfirmed ones is not, in the end, a matter of how dramatic the visual evidence is, or how compelling the local traditions associated with them are, or even how old the structures appear to be. What separates them is the presence or absence of systematic excavation, controlled artifact recovery, stratigraphic analysis, and peer-reviewed publication. Pavlopetri has all of these. Port Royal has all of these. Fuxian Lake has none of them at meaningful scale. Yonaguni has none of them either. The difference between a confirmed underwater site and an unconfirmed one is, in most cases, not a difference in the inherent interest or importance of the site. It is a difference in the level of institutional commitment to investigating it properly. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the Fuxian Lake question in a way that is both clarifying and somewhat sobering. The question is not really whether the structures on the lakebed are interesting. They clearly are, whether they turn out to be natural formations, man-made ruins, or some combination of the two. The question is not whether underwater archaeology is capable of answering the questions the site raises. It demonstrably is, as the work at Pavlopetri and Port Royal shows. The question is whether the conditions that would allow that archaeology to happen will ever be created at Fuxian Lake, and the answer to that question depends on decisions that have nothing to do with the lakebed itself. It depends on funding, on institutional priorities, on political will, on the relationship between local authorities and national archaeological bodies, on the willingness of the scientific community to engage with a site that has been associated with fringe claims, and on the basic administrative question of whether the underwater structures will ever receive formal archaeological protection. There is a quiet irony in the comparison between Fuxian Lake and the confirmed sites. The sites that have been most thoroughly investigated and most clearly confirmed are, in some ways, less mysterious than Fuxian Lake, not because they are less interesting, but because the process of investigation has replaced mystery with knowledge. We know what Pavlopetri was. We know roughly when it was occupied and when it sank. We know something about the people who lived there. The mystery has been transformed into history, which is a different and in many ways richer thing. Fuxian Lake, by contrast, remains in that earlier state before the transformation, where everything is still possible and nothing is confirmed. There is a kind of beauty to that state, a kind of openness that confirmed knowledge necessarily forecloses, but there is also a cost to it, because a site that remains unconfirmed is a site that cannot be fully protected, cannot be fully appreciated, and cannot take its proper place in the broader story of human civilization in the region. The global record of underwater archaeology is, when you step back and look at it as a whole, a record of extraordinary persistence. The sites that have been confirmed and understood were not confirmed easily or quickly. Pavla Petrie was first noticed in 1967 by Nicholas Fleming of the Institute of Oceanographic Sciences in Britain, but systematic modern excavation did not begin until more than 4 decades later. Port Royal has been known since 1692 and has been the subject of archaeological interest since the mid-20th century, but the most significant excavation work took decades to complete. Underwater archaeology is slow, expensive, technically demanding and logistically complicated in ways that land-based archaeology is not. The water presents constant challenges, and the constraints of diving time, visibility, current and depth mean that progress is measured in days and meters rather than weeks and hectares. This is not a reason to avoid doing it. It is simply a realistic description of what it requires. And it is part of why the absence of systematic investigation at Fuxian Lake, while frustrating, is not entirely surprising. The barriers are real. They are not insurmountable, but they are real. What the comparison with other sites ultimately offers is not a verdict on Fuxian Lake, but a set of coordinates. It shows where the site currently sits in relation to the broader landscape of underwater archaeological investigation. It is not alone in being contested. It is not unique in generating both serious interest and wild speculation. It is not unusual in having been documented on video without being subjected to systematic excavation, but it is also not confirmed, not protected, and not understood in the way that the best investigated sites have come to be understood. The distance between where Fuxian Lake is now and where it would need to be to join the company of confirmed underwater sites is not a distance measured in geography or even in technology. It is a distance measured in institutional commitment, in scientific attention, and in the slow, careful work of people who are willing to spend years in cold water asking questions that the lakebed may or may not be ready to answer. And that brings the story back, inevitably, to the people. Because behind every site, confirmed or unconfirmed, there are individuals who cared enough to keep looking. There are researchers who spent careers on questions that their colleagues considered marginal. There are divers who returned again and again to the same stretch of water because something in what they had seen would not let them stop. The confirmed sites did not become confirmed because the evidence was obvious and the path was clear. They became confirmed because specific people with specific convictions and specific skills pushed the work forward over long periods of time, often without institutional support, often against skepticism, often at personal cost. And at Fuxian Lake, there is one figure above all others who fits that description. A man who has spent more time beneath the surface of that lake than almost anyone else alive, who has seen the structures with his own eyes more times than he can easily count, and who has carried the weight of this mystery for more than 3 decades, largely without the institutional backing that might have transformed his observations into confirmed history. That man is Geng Wei. His name has appeared in almost every account of the Fuxian Lake mystery, and yet outside of China, and even within certain circles inside it, he remains a figure who is difficult to place neatly. He is not a professional archaeologist. He holds no university post, no institutional affiliation, no formal title that would give his observations the kind of automatic credibility that academic credentials tend to confer. What he has instead is time, decades of it, thousands of hours spent in the water, more than 100 dives into Fuxian Lake by most accounts, some of them documented, some of them conducted quietly and alone, all of them driven by a conviction that he first formed in 1992 when he descended into that cold, clear water and saw something on the lakebed that he could not explain away. It is worth pausing for a moment to think about what that means in practical terms. A single dive into Fuxian Lake is not a casual afternoon. The water is cold, particularly at depth. The pressure increases quickly as you descend through the clarity of the upper water into the darker, heavier layers below. At the depths where the structures reportedly sit, somewhere between 20 and 40 metres in the areas most frequently described, the cold is significant and the bottom time is limited. A diver without specialised equipment and training cannot simply stay down as long as they wish and look at whatever they like. Every dive is a negotiation between curiosity and physiology, between what you want to see and what your body and your equipment will allow. And yet Geng Wei kept going back, year after year, decade after decade, with different equipment as it became available, with different companions as interest in the site rose and fell, with different cameras as technology improved, and always with the same underlying question that had first pulled him beneath the surface more than 30 years ago. What is down there, and who put it there? His personal conviction, stated in multiple interviews and documented accounts over the years, is that the structures are man-made. Not natural geological formations, not the product of fault lines and limestone chemistry, but the deliberate work of human hands. He describes the stone arrangements as too regular, too purposeful, too geometrically consistent to have been produced by the lake itself. He talks about the wide flat surfaces that look to his eye like roads, about the platforms that rise in what appear to be deliberate tiers, about the opening in the top of one large structure that he has described as approximately 3 meters wide, which is a very specific measurement for something that is supposed to be accidental. He has said, in various ways and on various occasions, that standing on the lakebed near these structures does not feel like standing near a pile of rocks. It feels like standing in a place that was designed. That is a subjective description, and it is important to say so. Geng Wei is not a geologist. He is not trained to distinguish between the products of natural geological processes and the products of human construction. And in the cold, dim, disorienting environment of a deep lake, even trained observers can be misled. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns, finding shapes, finding the suggestion of intention in things that have no intention behind them. This is not a criticism of Geng Wei specifically. It is a general observation about human perception that applies to everyone who has ever seen a face in a cloud or a figure in a rock formation. The brain reaches for meaning because meaning is what it is built to find, and in an underwater environment, where visibility is limited and the mind is already primed by expectation, that tendency can be particularly powerful. But here is what makes Geng Wei's account more than just a story about a man who wanted to believe something. He did not simply dive and report. He organised. He brought others. He arranged the 2001 expedition that produced the first video documentation of the structures, footage that was subsequently reviewed by people who had not been in the water and who were not already committed to a particular interpretation. He worked to get the story in front of journalists, researchers, and eventually television producers. The 2006 CCTV expedition that brought national attention to the site would not have happened without the groundwork he had laid over the preceding 14 years. He functioned, in the absence of institutional support, as a kind of one-man archaeological advocacy operation, trying to build enough public and media interest to force the question of formal investigation onto someone's agenda. The frustration of that effort is something that comes through clearly in accounts of him. Not bitterness, exactly, but a kind of patient exhaustion that comes from spending decades asking a question that the people with the power to answer it have never quite committed to taking seriously. He has watched the site remain in limbo. He has watched expeditions come and go without producing the systematic investigation that would resolve the fundamental question. He has watched the internet transform the story of Fuxian Lake into something that exists in a strange parallel universe of speculation and exaggeration, where the structures are described with confident certainty as the remains of a 10,000-year-old city, or as evidence of a lost civilization that predates anything in the mainstream historical record, claims that he himself has never made and that he knows are harmful to the credibility of the genuine question he's been asking. There is something quietly poignant about that position. To have found something real, or at least something that appears real, and to watch it be simultaneously ignored by the institutions that could confirm it, and inflated by the communities that have no interest in confirming it. To be the person most associated with a mystery that you cannot solve alone, and to know that the conditions for solving it may never materialize in your lifetime. Geng Wei is not alone in his connection to the lake, however. Around him, over the years, a broader community has formed. Amateur researchers, local historians, documentary filmmakers, and curious individuals who have followed the story of Fuxian Lake with varying degrees of rigour and varying degrees of credulity. Some of them have dived in the lake themselves. Some have conducted their own informal investigations, reviewing the available video footage frame by frame, comparing the structures to known examples of both natural geological formations and confirmed man-made ruins, and reaching conclusions that range from cautious interest to absolute certainty. This community exists largely online now, in forums and comment sections and social media threads, where the conversation about Fuxian Lake continues in a form that is simultaneously more accessible and less reliable than the kind of investigation the site actually needs. There are also the people who have lived beside the lake for generations, and who have their own relationship to what lies beneath it, one that does not require video documentation or peer review to feel real and meaningful. The fishermen who have worked the lake's surface for decades carry their own knowledge of its behaviour, its moods, its peculiarities. Some of them report noticing unusual things in the deeper parts of the lake, areas where the water behaves differently, where currents seem to move in ways that do not match the surface conditions, where the light plays strangely in the depths on certain days. These observations are anecdotal, and it would be a mistake to treat them as evidence of anything specific, but they are part of the texture of life around the lake, part of the way in which Fuxian Lake is experienced by the people who are closest to it, and they matter as a reminder that the mystery of the lake is not only an intellectual puzzle for researchers and divers, it is also a lived reality for a community that has coexisted with it for a very long time. There is one account from the 2001 period of investigations that tends to surface whenever the human dimension of the Fuxian Lake story is discussed. A diver who was part of one of the expeditions organised during that period reportedly became disoriented near one of the larger structures on the lakebed. The account, as it has been told and retold, describes the diver surfacing with what seemed to be an unexplained gap in their sense of time, uncertain of how long they had been down, uncertain of exactly what they had seen or experienced in the vicinity of the structure. This story is anecdotal in the strictest sense. It has not been independently verified, it has not been documented in any formal report, and it exists primarily as something that was recounted after the fact by someone who was present during the expedition. It would be irresponsible to present it as evidence of anything unusual about the site itself, but it is worth noting, not because it suggests something supernatural, but because it illustrates the psychological intensity that the site generates in the people who engage with it directly. Diving in cold, dark water near large, unfamiliar structures at depth is a genuinely disorienting experience under any circumstances. The combination of physical pressure, limited visibility, cold, and the cognitive weight of believing that you might be looking at something historically significant creates conditions in which the mind can do strange things with time and perception. The account, whatever its precise truth, reflects something real about the experience of being in that water, near those structures, in the grip of a question that no one has yet been able to answer. International attention has come to Fuxian Lake in waves over the years, typically tied to the publication of new footage or the airing of a documentary. Western media outlets have covered the story periodically, usually framing it in terms that sit somewhere between genuine curiosity and the kind of breathless mystery-mongering that the site's more careful investigators find frustrating. Documentaries have been made, some of them more rigorous than others, some of them content to present the most dramatic possible version of the story without engaging seriously with the geological and archaeological questions that would need to be resolved before any dramatic claims could be justified. The international coverage has had the effect of keeping the story alive in a global sense, ensuring that Fuxian Lake has a presence in the broader conversation about underwater mysteries, but it has not translated into the kind of sustained, serious scientific engagement that the site would need to move forward. What is missing, and what has always been missing, is an institutional champion. A university department, a national museum, a government archaeological body, or an international research organisation that is willing to commit the resources and the credibility necessary to conduct a proper systematic investigation of the site. Every confirmed underwater archaeological site in the world has such a champion, or has had one at a critical moment in its history. Pavla Petri had the Institute of Oceanographic Sciences, and later a collaborative team from the University of Nottingham. Port Royal had the Institute of Nautical Archaeology. Even contested sites like the Yonaguni Monument in Japan have attracted sustained academic attention from researchers willing to engage seriously with the question of natural versus man-made formation. Fuxian Lake has had gangway and the occasional television crew and a great deal of internet interest, and very little else. The weight of that absence falls most heavily on the site itself, but it also falls on the people who care about it. On Geng Wei, who has spent more of his life in that water than almost anyone, and who has never had the institutional backing that might have transformed his observations into something the scientific community would be compelled to engage with. On the local researchers and amateur investigators who have followed the story with genuine seriousness and found themselves unable to push it past a certain point without the tools and the credentials that formal institutions provide. And on the broader community of people in China and internationally who are genuinely curious about what lies beneath Fuxian Lake and who have never been given a satisfying answer, not because the answer does not exist, but because the conditions for finding it have never quite been created. There is something in this that speaks to a broader truth about how mysteries get resolved, or fail to get resolved. The history of discovery is not simply a history of evidence. It is a history of attention, of institutional priority, of the particular combination of curiosity and resources and timing that allows a question to be pursued seriously rather than left to drift in the space between speculation and confirmation. Some questions get answered because the evidence is overwhelming and the path forward is clear. Others get answered because someone, somewhere, decides that the question is worth the investment. And some questions remain open, not because they are unanswerable, but because the decision to answer them has never quite been made. Fuxian Lake sits in that third category for now. It is a question that has been asked repeatedly, loudly, and with considerable passion, but that has not yet been met with the institutional response that would allow it to be seriously addressed. And as long as that remains the case, the lake will continue to hold its silence. The structures on the lakebed will continue to sit in the cold and the dark, neither confirmed nor dismissed, neither protected nor destroyed, neither understood nor entirely forgotten. And the people who have devoted years of their lives to the question of what they are will continue to carry that question, in the particular way that only people who have seen something they cannot explain are capable of carrying it, not lightly and not easily, but with a kind of stubborn, patient conviction that the question matters, and that one day someone will agree. And that leads, perhaps inevitably, to the question of what happens to a site like this when time and tourism and environmental change begin to close in around it, when the window for answering the question starts to narrow, and when the cost of continued inaction becomes harder and harder to ignore. Fuxian Lake is not simply a mystery. It is also a place, a real, physical, living place with shorelines and fishermen and morning light on the water and the particular smell of a subtropical lake at the end of summer. And like all real places, it exists in time, which means it changes. It is affected by the things that happen around it and to it, by the decisions people make about how to use it and how to treat it. by the slow accumulation of pressure that comes with population growth and tourism and agricultural expansion, and the thousand small choices that add up over decades to something that can no longer be undone. To understand the conservation situation at Fuxian Lake, it helps to understand what the lake was like not so long ago. In the early 20th century, the communities around Fuxian Lake were small and largely agricultural. The lake was valued primarily as a fishing resource, and its extraordinary clarity, a function of its depth, its underground spring sources, and its relatively low nutrient load, was simply part of its natural character. Visibility of up to 12 metres in some conditions was not remarkable to the people who had always known it that way. It was simply how the lake looked. The surrounding mountains and subtropical forest held the watershed in a kind of natural equilibrium, and while the lake was used, it was not yet under the kind of pressure that would come later. That began to change through the latter half of the 20th century as Yunnan province developed economically, and the population around the lake's shores grew. Agricultural activity expanded, and with it came the familiar consequences: fertilizer runoff, increased sediment, the slow introduction of nutrients into a lake system that had evolved in relative isolation from such inputs. Nitrogen and phosphorus entering a deep, clear lake do not immediately transform it into something murky and depleted. The process is gradual, but it is also cumulative, and it is largely irreversible once it reaches certain thresholds. By the 1980s and into the 1990s, water quality monitoring in Fuxian Lake was beginning to show measurable changes. Not catastrophic changes, not the kind of sudden collapse that makes international headlines, but the quiet, statistical kind of change that environmental scientists recognize as early warning. Algal blooms became more frequent in certain areas. The transparency of the water, while still remarkable by comparison with many Chinese lakes, was no longer quite what it had been in the middle of the century. The lake was still beautiful. It was still one of the cleaner bodies of water in Yunnan. But the trajectory was not encouraging. Tourism arrived in earnest in the 1990s and accelerated through the 2000s. This is not in itself a straightforward bad thing. Tourism brought economic activity to communities that needed it. It brought attention to a region whose natural beauty had previously been known mainly to those who lived within reach of it. It created reasons to care about the lake's health that extended beyond the fishing communities who had always depended on it. But tourism also brought boats and development along the shoreline and recreational diving and the particular kind of environmental stress that comes from large numbers of people engaging with a sensitive natural system without always understanding the cumulative effect of what they're doing. The boat traffic alone, concentrated in certain areas and at certain times of year, generates wake and propeller turbulence that can disturb lakebed sediments in shallow areas and affect water clarity. Shoreline development for hotels and restaurants and visitor facilities reduces the natural buffer zone between agricultural land and the lake edge, making it easier for runoff to enter the water directly. And recreational diving, while individually harmless in most cases, becomes a different kind of problem when it concentrates around specific locations, as it inevitably does when those locations are associated with something as compelling as a potential underwater city. The structures on the lakebed of Fuxian Lake, whatever they ultimately prove to be, are not robust. Stone, even large stone, can be damaged by direct physical contact over time, especially when that contact is repeated and unregulated. Divers who touch or rest on stone surfaces, who stir up sediment around them, who inadvertently dislodge smaller pieces in the process of manoeuvring in the water, are not acting maliciously. Most of them are acting out of genuine curiosity and excitement. But the cumulative effect of many such visits, over many years, with no systematic effort to document the baseline condition of the structures before the visits began, is a kind of slow erosion of the very evidence that would be needed to answer the question of what the structures are. This is the particular cruelty of an unprotected archaeological site that has become famous before it has been studied. The fame generates the visits, and the visits generate the damage, and the damage makes the eventual study harder, and in some cases it makes certain kinds of evidence permanently unavailable. In 2007, the Yunnan provincial government took a step that was, in intent, a positive one. Parts of Fuxian Lake and its surrounding landscape were designated as a protected scenic area, a classification that brought the region under a degree of administrative oversight and created a framework for managing tourism and development in a more controlled way. Boat traffic in certain areas became subject to regulation. Some construction along the shoreline was restricted. The designation acknowledged, at least implicitly, that Fuxian Lake was a place of value that required a degree of protection from the pressures acting upon it. But a scenic area designation is not an archaeological protection order. It is not the same as declaring the underwater structures a site of cultural heritage significance and placing them under the kind of legal and institutional protection that would restrict access, require permits for any activity near the structures, mandate documentation of the site's condition, and create accountability for any damage that occurs. The 2007 designation protected the landscape. It did not protect the lakebed. And the distinction matters enormously when what you're trying to protect is something that cannot be seen from the surface and whose significance has not been formally established by the institutions that have the authority to establish it. No UNESCO World Heritage designation exists for Fuxian Lake, and none has been formally sought for the underwater structures. This is partly a consequence of the unresolved question of whether the structures are man-made, since UNESCO designations for cultural heritage sites require a degree of established cultural or historical significance that the Fuxian Lake structures do not yet possess in any formally recognised sense. But it is also a consequence of the broader institutional inertia that has characterised the response to the site from the beginning. UNESCO designation requires an active application process, national government support, and a body of documentation that demonstrates the site's significance and the commitment of the relevant authorities to its protection. None of these conditions currently exist for the Fuxian Lake underwater structures, and without the prior step of formal archaeological investigation and recognition, they are unlikely to exist anytime soon. What a proper underwater archaeological survey of Fuxian Lake would actually require is worth considering in some detail, because the gap between what has been done and what would need to be done is one of the most instructive things about the situation. The dives conducted by Geng Wei and by the CCTV expedition in 2006 produced video documentation of the structures. That documentation is valuable. But video footage of underwater stone features without systematic context is not archaeology, it is observation. To move from observation to archaeology, a number of additional steps would be necessary, each of them technically demanding and expensive. The site would need to be systematically mapped, using either ROV technology equipped with sonar and photogrammetric cameras, or a combination of diver-conducted surveys and acoustic mapping equipment to produce a detailed three-dimensional record of the structure's positions, dimensions, and relationships to one another. This kind of grid-based mapping is standard practice at confirmed underwater archaeological sites, and is what allows researchers to identify patterns, measure features accurately, and track changes over time. Sediment coring would be needed in multiple locations around and between the structures to extract layered samples of the lakebed material that could be analysed for organic content, pollen, chemical signatures, and other indicators of past environmental and human activity. If people lived and worked in the area now submerged beneath Fuxian Lake, they left traces in the sediment, traces that could potentially be dated using radiocarbon methods, and that could provide information about the kinds of activities that took place there. This kind of sediment analysis has been used effectively at other underwater sites to establish chronologies and identify evidence of occupation even when no large artifacts remain. Any artifacts encountered during the survey, pottery sherds, tool fragments, organic material, building debris, would need to be recovered using controlled excavation techniques, catalogued, conserved, and analysed. The absence of artifacts from the Fuxian Lake structures is one of the most significant unresolved questions about the site. Either the structures have been stripped of associated material over time, or the material is present but buried in the sediment and has not been found because no systematic search has been conducted, or the structures are natural formations that were never associated with human activity in the first place. A proper survey would be designed in part to distinguish between these possibilities. All of this requires equipment, personnel, time and funding at a scale that has never been committed to Fuxian Lake. ROV systems capable of operating at depths of 40 metres with the precision needed for archaeological survey cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to deploy and operate. Sediment coring equipment, laboratory analysis, conservation of recovered artifacts, publication of results in peer-reviewed form, these are not small expenses. They require the kind of institutional commitment that comes from universities, national heritage bodies, or major research foundations, the kind of commitment that has never materialised for this particular site. And so the survey has not happened, and the questions remain open, and the window in which the evidence might be cleanest and most accessible is not getting wider. There is a particular irony embedded in all of this that is worth sitting with for a moment. The very thing that makes Fuxian Lake compelling, the possibility that something remarkable lies beneath its surface, is also the thing that has made it vulnerable. If the structures on the lakebed were simply natural geological formations of no particular interest, they would attract no divers, no documentary crews, no amateur investigators, no internet speculation. They would sit undisturbed in the cold dark, as they presumably sat for centuries before Geng Wei made his first dive in 1992. But because they might be something more, because they carry the weight of a question that people find genuinely exciting, they attract attention. And attention, without the accompanying framework of protection and systematic study, is a form of pressure. The interest generated by the mystery is, paradoxically, one of the things that threatens the mystery's eventual resolution. Every unrecorded dive near the structures, every piece of sediment disturbed, every stone surface abraded by contact, is a small reduction in the quality of the evidence that a future archaeologist would need to work with. The lake does not know this. The divers, for the most part, do not intend this, but it is happening nonetheless, quietly and incrementally, in the way that most environmental and archaeological damage happens, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of many small moments that individually seem harmless. The communities that live around Fuxian Lake exist in a complicated relationship with all of this. For the Yi and Pu people who have been part of this landscape for generations, the lake is not primarily a mystery or a tourist attraction or an archaeological puzzle. It is a place. It is water and fish and weather and memory and the particular quality of light on a particular morning. The oral traditions that speak of a sunken city are part of the fabric of how these communities understand their own history and their relationship to the landscape they inhabit. Those traditions do not require scientific confirmation to be meaningful. They have been meaningful for generations without it. But the arrival of outside interest in the lake, the tourists, the documentary crews, the amateur divers, the internet speculation, has changed the relationship between the local communities and their own landscape in ways that are not always comfortable. The lake that was once primarily theirs has become, in a cultural sense, partly everyone else's. The stories that were once local have become global, and the question of what lies beneath the water, which was once held with a kind of quiet familiarity, has been transformed into something louder and more contested and more complicated. This is not unique to Fuxian Lake. It is a pattern that plays out wherever a local place becomes the subject of global curiosity. The question of who has the right to define a place's significance, to investigate it, to speak authoritatively about it, and to determine what kind of protection it deserves, is never a simple one. At Fuxian Lake, it is further complicated by the fact that the most significant ongoing advocate for the site has been not a local community member, but Geng Wei, an outsider who arrived in 1992 and stayed, in a sense, for the rest of his life. The local communities have their own relationship to the lake and their own views on what it contains and what should be done about it. Those views deserve to be part of any conversation about the site's future, and they have not always been centred in the way they should be. What is needed, and what has not yet arrived, is a convergence of things that rarely arrive together without deliberate effort. Institutional commitment from a body with the resources and the credibility to conduct a proper investigation. Legal protection for the underwater structures that recognises their potential significance without requiring that significance to be proven before protection begins. Community engagement that brings the Yimpu people's knowledge and perspective into the process, rather than treating the site as something external to their experience. And time that is, unfortunately, not unlimited. Every year that passes without a systematic survey is a year in which the site's condition changes, in which the sediment shifts, in which the evidence becomes slightly less accessible, in which the window for the clearest possible answer narrows just a little more. The lake does not wait. The water moves. The sediment settles and resettles. The tourist boats cross back and forth above the structures, and the recreational divers descend and ascend, and the agricultural runoff continues its slow journey from the surrounding hills toward the water, and the years accumulate. And somewhere on the lake bed, at a depth of 20 to 40 metres, in water that is cold and dark and extraordinarily clear by the standards of most lakes, the stone structures sit as they have sat for however long they have been there, holding whatever answer they contain, waiting for the question to be asked in a way that is serious enough to deserve a serious response. Whether that moment comes before the evidence is too compromised to yield a clear answer is at this point genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is not a comfortable place to rest for anyone who cares about what the lake might be keeping. Which brings us, at last, to what any of this means in a larger sense, and to the question of what Fuxian Lake sees about us, not just about what lies beneath it. And so we return, at last, to the surface. To the stillness of the water on a quiet morning, when the mist sits low over Fuxian Lake, and the mountains hold their shapes in the early light, and the air carries that particular quality that only very clear water seems to generate, a kind of coolness that is not quite cold, a brightness that is not quite sharp. The lake looks simple from up here. It looks like a lake. It looks like a beautiful, unremarkable body of water in a mountainous province in southern China, the kind of place you might visit for a weekend and leave feeling rested without ever quite knowing why. And in a sense, that is exactly what it is. The beauty is real. The stillness is real. The feeling of being held by a landscape that has been here far longer than any human concern is real. What lies beneath is also real, in the sense that something is down there, something documented on video, something measured in rough dimensions by divers who went down and came back up, and said, carefully or enthusiastically depending on who they were, that the lakebed holds structures that are difficult to explain away. That is the honest position, and it is worth stating clearly one more time before we leave. The structures exist and have been documented imperfectly through underwater video footage captured on multiple expeditions between 2001 and 2006 and beyond. They cover a reported area of approximately 2.4 square kilometres. They include what appear to be stone platforms, walls, paved surfaces, and at least one stepped form that some observers have described as resembling a pyramid. The stones appear to be fitted rather than randomly arranged. No artefacts have been officially recovered. No peer-reviewed excavation has been completed. No independent stratigraphic analysis has been published. Chinese archaeologists who have examined the footage have offered cautious assessments, neither fully confirming nor fully denying a man-made origin. The site has not been officially designated as an archaeological site. It is, in the most precise language available, an unresolved question, and that is not a failure. That is simply where the evidence currently stands. What is harder to explain, and what sits with a person longer than the facts themselves, is how a place like this can remain in limbo for decades. Not because the technology does not exist to investigate it more thoroughly, not because the interest is absent, not because the question is unimportant, but because the combination of institutional caution, limited resources, jurisdictional complexity, and the particular way that unofficial mysteries tend to be treated by official bodies has kept this site in a kind of permanent suspension. It has been noticed but not studied, filmed but not excavated, debated but not resolved, and the decades have passed with the structures sitting undisturbed in the cold water, neither confirmed nor dismissed, holding their ambiguity with a patience that seems almost deliberate. There is something quietly instructive about this. We live in an era that is very good at generating interest and very slow at sustaining the kind of careful, unglamorous, methodical attention that actually resolves questions. The story of Fuxian Lake spread globally through documentaries and online articles and forum discussions and YouTube videos, reaching millions of people who found it genuinely fascinating. And yet the number of people who have conducted systematic peer-reviewed research at the site remains very small. The gap between the scale of the interest and the scale of the actual scientific response is enormous. This is not unique to Fuxian Lake. It is a pattern that repeats itself wherever mystery and media intersect. The mystery is amplified, the investigation is not, and the site sits in the gap between those two things, waiting. To understand why this matters beyond the specific question of what lies on the lakebed, it helps to think about what archaeology actually does, not in the dramatic sense of discovery and revelation, but in the quiet, careful sense of preservation. When an archaeological site is properly excavated and documented, it does not simply yield answers. It preserves the possibility of better answers in the future. The act of systematic documentation, of recording the precise position of every stone, every layer of sediment, every trace of organic material, creates a record that future researchers with better tools and better questions can return to. It is, in a sense, a conversation across time. The archaeologist working today is not just answering questions for the present. They are leaving notes for the future. When that documentation does not happen, when a site is accessed informally, filmed from shifting angles by divers without standardized recording protocols, discussed without the grounding of stratigraphic analysis, the conversation is interrupted. The notes are not left. The future researcher arrives and finds that the record is incomplete, that the context has been disturbed, that the clearest possible answer is no longer available, because the conditions that would have yielded it have been altered. This is what the passage of time without proper investigation means for Fuxian Lake. It is not simply delay. It is, in small but real increments, the narrowing of what will eventually be knowable. And yet for all of this, the lake endures. The water is still extraordinarily clear by the standards of most bodies of water, with visibility that can reach 12 metres on a good day. The mountains still hold the lake in their slow embrace. The Yianpu communities are still there, living with the water as they have always lived with it, in the way that people who have been in a place for generations live with it, which is to say with a familiarity that does not require explanation. They know the lake's moods, they know its seasons, they know the particular way the light falls on the water in the late afternoon in the dry months, and they know which parts of the shore to avoid when the wind comes down from the northern ridges. And they know, in the way that communities know things that have been passed down through enough generations to become simply part of the texture of life, that something is down there. They have always known this. The oral traditions that speak of a sunken city, of a place called Yuyuan with its markets and temples and roads, did not begin with Gengwei's dive in 1992. They were already there. They were already old. They had been carried through generations the way important knowledge is carried when there is no other means of carrying it, in the mouths and memories of people who found it worth preserving. There is a certain kind of respect owed to that. Not the uncritical acceptance of every detail in every version of every story, but the recognition that oral traditions are not simply decorations on the surface of history. They are often its deepest archive, The story of Troy was a legend for centuries before Heinrich Schliemann began digging at Hisarlik in 1870 and found layers of occupation that confirmed a city had indeed stood there, had indeed been destroyed, had indeed been the kind of place that left a mark deep enough to survive in memory across millennia. The submerged landscapes of Doggerland, the vast plain that once connected Britain to mainland Europe before rising sea levels flooded it roughly 8,000 years ago, were suspected by researchers partly because of the unusual density of prehistoric artefacts dredged up by fishing nets in the North Sea, but also because of the persistence of certain coastal traditions in northern European communities that seemed to preserve a memory of land where there was now water. Legend is not proof, but it is sometimes a map, and the map the Yi and Pu people have been carrying for generations points directly to the floor of Fuxian Lake. What makes this particular mystery feel different from many others, what gives it a quality that lingers after the facts have settled, is the combination of things it holds together simultaneously. It holds geological reality because the lake does sit on a graben, a block of land dropped between fault lines in a tectonically active region, and the submersion of a shoreline settlement is not scientifically implausible. It holds historical possibility because the Dian kingdom flourished in this region between roughly the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, and its capital has never been conclusively identified, and the proximity of the Shijaishan site with its extraordinary bronze artifacts to the lake is not a coincidence that can be entirely dismissed. It holds documented observation because the video footage from the 2001 and 2006 expeditions exists and shows stone arrangements that at least some qualified observers have found difficult to attribute entirely to natural processes. And it holds human memory in the form of traditions that have persisted through generations without requiring scientific validation to remain meaningful to the people who carry them. None of these things alone would be sufficient to declare the mystery solved, but together they form something that deserves more than the benign neglect it has largely received. They form a question serious enough to warrant a serious answer, and the serious answer has not yet been attempted at the scale the question requires. There is a particular feeling that comes with standing at the edge of a lake like this, or with imagining yourself there, which is perhaps what we have been doing together tonight. It is not quite the feeling of standing before an answer. It is closer to the feeling of standing before a door that has not been opened. You can see the door. You can see that it is real. You can even see, through the gap at the bottom, a thin line of light that suggests something on the other side. But the door has not been opened, and you do not have the key, and the people who might have the key have not yet decided that opening this particular door is their priority. And so you stand there with the weight of the question, which is not a bad thing to carry. Some questions are worth carrying for a long time. Some doors are worth standing before even when they do not open. The lake at night is a different thing from the lake in daylight. The clarity of the water is still there, but the light is not, and what was visible from the surface in the afternoon is now hidden in a darkness that is absolute at depth. The mountains are still shapes against the sky. The water is still. The cold that rises from the underground springs that feed the lake is still present, still moving upward through the water column in the particular way that cold water moves, slowly and with weight. And somewhere below, at a depth of 20 to 40 metres, in water that has not been touched by sunlight since it went under, the stone structures sit as they have always sat, in whatever arrangement they have always held, carrying whatever meaning they have always carried, whether that meaning is the meaning of human hands that cut and fitted and placed them, or the meaning of geological forces that fractured and dropped and arranged them, or some combination of the two that no one has yet been careful enough to untangle. The lake does not know we're thinking about it. The water does not care about our uncertainty. The stone does not wait for our conclusion. These are human concerns, the urgency, the desire to know, the frustration at not knowing, the need to resolve. The lake simply continues to be a lake, deep and clear and cold and very old, holding whatever it holds with the complete indifference of a place that existed long before the question was asked, and will continue to exist long after we have stopped asking it. And perhaps that is the most honest note on which to let this settle, not with a resolution, because there is no resolution to offer, not with a verdict, because no verdict has been reached, but with the acknowledgement that the question is real, that the lake is real, that the structures on its floor are real in the sense that they have been seen and filmed and measured, and that the people who have lived beside this water for generations have always known that something was down there, and that this knowing, this quiet, persistent knowing, is itself a form of evidence that deserves to be taken seriously even when it cannot be quantified. Fuxian Lake is not the only place in the world where the past has been swallowed by water. The Earth's surface is covered with the traces of things that were once above the water and are now below it. Coastlines that are now sea floor, valleys that are now reservoirs, plains that are now bays. The world has been flooded and drained and flooded again across geological time in ways that make the human experience of landscape seem very brief and very provisional. What makes Fuxian Lake feel significant is not that it is unique in this respect, but that it holds its question so close to the surface, so legible, so almost answered, that the distance between what we know and what we could know if we tried hard enough seems almost insultingly small. If you're listening to this in the dark, wherever you are, whatever the hour, whatever the weather outside your window, I hope the lake has settled into your imagination in a way that is more restful than restless. It is a beautiful place by any measure. The water is clear. The mountains are real. The people who live there are living full and complicated lives that have nothing to do with the question we have been turning over tonight. The mystery is a layer on top of a place that does not need the mystery to be worth caring about. But the mystery is there, and it is genuine, and it has not been resolved. And somewhere in the cold, dark water, at a depth that a competent diver could reach on a good day with the right equipment, there are stone arrangements that may be the remnants of a civilization that once stood above the water and was taken beneath it by forces that we can describe in geological terms, but can still barely imagine in human ones. People who lived there, people who built things, people who woke up one morning or perhaps many mornings and felt the ground shift beneath them, or watched the water rise, or heard the sound that precedes the kind of event that ends cities. People whose names we do not know and whose faces we cannot picture and whose language has not survived, but whose possible work sits on the floor of a lake in Yunnan province, waiting in the extraordinary patience of stone. That is worth something. That is worth the careful attention it has not yet fully received, and perhaps one day it will get it. Perhaps a team with the right equipment and the right institutional backing and the right relationship with the communities who have lived beside this water for generations will descend to the lakebed with the methodical seriousness that the question deserves and come back up with an answer that is clear enough to hold. Perhaps the door will be opened. Perhaps the light on the other side will be exactly what the question always suspected it was. Until then, the lake holds its depth. The water holds its clarity. The stone holds its silence. And the question holds us gently in the way that good questions always do, not demanding an answer, but making us feel, in the asking of it, just a little more awake to the strangeness and the age and the quiet complexity of the world we're moving through. Sleep well, wherever you are. The lake will still be there in the morning, and so, perhaps, will the wondering